I am being heard. Yes? The first time. We want to get our proceedings underway, and I wonder, would somebody advise people who are circulating outside to come in? Call you in a minute, Fionnuala. Right. Just wait till a few people come into the hall. So I'm going to get our proceedings underway, delegates, and I want first of all to call on the Chair of Standing Orders, Fionnuala Richardson, to move Standing Orders Report number 2. Fionnuala.
Good morning, delegates. Standing Orders Report number 2. Number 1, Motion 87 in Rural Community Development, tabled by the Kells branch from Meath East. The first sentence of this motion was inadvertently left off the agenda. It's there in the report underlined. Second point, an emergency motion in relation to bankers' salaries will be taken on Sunday morning after the debate on culture, heritage and the Gaeltacht. And the text, very brief text, is there, tabled by Dublin West Constituency Council, and the text is there on the Standing Orders Report. I move.
Thank you, Fionnuala. The report is moved. It's formally seconded. Is it agreed? Nobody disagrees? So I declare Standing Orders Report number 2 adopted. Thank you, Fionnuala. And we're now going to proceed to the debate on justice and equality, which means we have to take motions number 33 to 37, and I'm calling on the mover of motion number 33 from the Dublin Rathdown Constituency Council to move the motion. Letty.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to see such a full hall here at this time. I'm speaking on motion 33, and this is where conference calls and notes the difficulties that adults with severe physical or intellectual disabilities and their families encounter in having to deal with multiple agencies in order to access the care and support necessary for them to lead full lives. And we all know, and I certainly know, of families within our own communities who have children with severe physical or intellectual disabilities. They can be lucky and they can get their child into a school. And I say lucky because this is by no means a given. And I know again within my own constituency, families who cannot get their child, maybe who has autism or other intellectual different abilities, into a school. I know of families who had to set up their own school in order to allow their child access to education. And that is subjecting parents and families to a life of fundraising and trying to scrape money together in order to get their child some sort of an education. Whatever support is there for these youngsters, it seems to disappear once the children become 18. And it is not right that these young people are literally handed back to their parents or their families or carers without a plan. And it is not right that these young people are condemned to a life of sitting at home without any ongoing education or any stimulation for them. Parents, families and carers, they have to navigate through various services again. Now, apparently there is a budget, but trying to access that budget, it's not at all clear. And where you have somebody who maybe with a disability and during their time in school or whatever area they are, where a speech therapist hasn't been replaced for over 6 months. This is a situation that isn't good enough and cannot go on. But once they become 18, there is literally nothing there for them. Those youngsters cannot and do not go on to work or go on to college or do what people with different abilities can do. So conference calls for the establishment of a single state unit entity to provide access to the necessary comprehensive support services for adults with severe physical or intellectual disabilities and their families, to replace the current fractured and opaque system of state, commercial and voluntary services. I move this motion.
Thank you, Letty. That was Councillor Letty McCarthy, who is also our candidate in the Dublin Rathdown constituency, moving motion number 33. And can I again emphasise, please, movers and seconders and speakers to please say who they are and their branch or constituency or section or whatever before, so that we have a record of an accurate record. So, seconder, formally seconded. So motion number 33 is before the floor. Motion number 34 now, in the name of Labour Equality.
Friends and comrades, the aim of this motion is not just to end the direct provision system, which should not be operating in this country. It's to make amends for that system by granting an amnesty to anyone who has been in that system for more than 12 months, to give people who have been in that system a path to normalisation, a path back to a normal life, and a way of integrating into this country's life in a way that shows that they are respected. We can't complain about any other country's immigration systems when our system is deliberately punitive and for profit. We can't tolerate this system continuing in its current form, and we must make amends for one of the worst things we are doing to people at the moment in this country. I ask you to support this motion to help those who are trapped in a system that does not treat them as human, that treats them as a source of profit, and that resents even a slice of bread to a sick child. We have to stop this system. And can I just address the addendum to the motion? I think it's a very good addendum, but I would be concerned that it is lecturing other countries about something that we are worse at. The Dublin Convention and the Dublin Regulations on acceptance of refugees into the EU has ignited such a fire in Europe that we have to take responsibility for our part in that. So I ask you to support this motion and to end the system of direct provision and to give people a normal life. Thank you, comrades.
Pádraig, just to be clear, are you accepting the addendum?
Yes, accepting the addendum.
You're accepting the addendum. Okay, thank you, Pádraig. Is there a seconder for the motion now? Formally seconded. Thank you, delegates. I know, just, Sean, I'll chair the conference. Right? Yeah. So now I want to call on Pádraig.
Sorry for that. Pádraig McLaughlin, Chair, Labour Equality.
Thanks, Pádraig. Now, again, can I emphasise, the first thing you do when you get up is say who you are and what branch, constituency, section, whatever you're representing, please. Now, can we have the mover for the addendum in the name of Inishbigel Mayo? Sorry, Sean.
Jeremy Holt, Inishbigel, Mayo, affiliated, I think, to the Westport branch, according to the bits of paper. I am the sole member. I'm like a chairman of a tribunal. Sole member on Inishbigel, but there you go. I think what I'd like to do, the easiest and quickest thing to do, is to just read you an email I sent to the relevant minister. Dear Minister, I'm advised by the Office of the Attorney General to address my representation to you. A report in the Guardian online edition dated 24th of the 9th, 2018, referred to the revocation of registration of the Médecins Sans Frontières vessel Aquarius. Aquarius is operating search and rescue missions in the Mediterranean, as indeed are the Irish Navy vessels. The report states that having been deflagged by Gibraltar and re-registered by the Panama Maritime Authority, our EU colleague Italy brought pressure to bear on the PMA to again deregister the Aquarius. On humanitarian grounds, I call on the Irish authorities to immediately extend an offer of Irish flag registration to any humanitarian search and rescue vessel stripped of registration on spurious or political grounds. Yours sincerely. Chairman, I was delighted to see that the relevant minister is Comrade Ross. So I urge our parliamentarians to do their very best anyway. Yeah. And if anybody's speaking to this motion afterwards, I'd love to hear if there are any medics or any volunteers, overseas volunteers, maybe could put a word or two in. Thank you. Thank you. I commend the amendment.
Now, is there a seconder for the addendum? It's formally seconded. Thank you, delegates. Now, motion number 35 in the name of the Crumlin Kimmage Frank Klutsky branch.
Just checking this, check out who I actually am. Michael O'Sullivan from Dublin South Central, actually from the Joe DC branch, but the person proposing originally is unwell. In our motion is about pathways to citizenship, but I would just like to say that in the motion it refers to people who were born outside the country, but since we submitted the motion, the issue about the young lad in Wicklow, Eric Shue, who was born in this country, has lived in this country, has gone to school in this country, and now he's been told he's not an Irish citizen, has come up. And I just want to welcome the comments from Brendan Howland to say that the Labour Party are going to do something about that awful amendment that was passed in this country in 2004, which has led to situations like this where people who are born and bred in this country are told that they're not Irish citizens. So I welcome that, and I think it's something that it's long overdue. The amendment allows us to legislate to stop this sort of thing happening. But people like Eric are going to face the same problem that's identified in this motion. We've been lucky over the last 20 years or so to welcome hundreds of thousands of people who come to live and work in this country. And luckier still that many of those want to make their life here. They want to settle here and become citizens. And that's a good thing. It means they can continue to contribute, and it means then that we have equality for everybody. Everybody is part of our society. However, there's a problem. Sometime about 2011, we hiked up the fees for people who want to become citizens. So the fee for a single person, one person on their own becoming a citizen, is at least €1,250, €1,250. You might have additional costs because you've got to get some documents translated. If you're a family, if you come here and raise your family here and 3 or 4 kids and a couple, it could cost them €3,000 or €4,000 to get citizenship. That causes an immediate problem because a lot of people who came here work in jobs that aren't really well paid. So we have an initial problem with equality in that migrants who are well paid can access citizenship, those who are not so well paid will put it off. We have an extra problem that's happened because of Brexit. There are lots of people here with British passports who've lived here for 30, 40 years, raised their family here, may now be pensioners here. They're being told that they have to pay €1,250 to get a passport here now, which is because of Brexit, something that they didn't think they needed, now they need it. And on the other hand, we have people who may never have set foot in the country, who happen to have an Irish grandparent and can get the same citizenship rights for €270. So these are anomalies that we can deal with. They're anomalies we need to deal with, because we need to make sure that the diversity that has contributed so much to the country is supported by equality. So I urge you to support the motion.
Seconder, is there a seconder? Formally seconded. And now we're moving to motion number 36 in the name of Dunleary Constituency Council. Deirdre.
Thanks, Chair. Deirdre Kingston, Dunleary Constituency, Blackrock Branch. Comrades, this motion from the Dunleary constituency expresses solidarity with all of those who have been a victim of sexual abuse or violence. 42% of women have experienced some sort of sexual abuse or assault, and over a quarter of men have experienced one or the other as well. The SAVI report, which stands for Sexual Abuse and Violence in Ireland, was carried out to assess the levels of sexual abuse in Ireland, and it looked at the impact on victims as well, and also looked at how we should resource services in this country and the attitudes towards people that have been victims of sexual assault. This report was last carried out 16 years ago. It's a huge amount of time, and a huge amount has changed since then. There's been an awakening in this area, and many women and men are now more confident about talking about their experiences, and they feel that they have the support in society as well to come forward and speak about it openly. So the importance of these studies can't be overestimated. We know that only a very small percentage of people actually report these experiences to the Gardaí. So reports like these are very important because it provides a safe space for people to discuss their experiences. It also ensures that there is investment in these areas, and that sends a really important message to survivors. It tells them that they are worthy of this investment and that we support them 100% in dealing with their trauma. It's nothing to be ashamed of, it's nothing to be brushed under the carpet, which is why it was pretty unacceptable to see that Fine Gael were delaying committing to spending just €1 million on an updated report. Since then, they have said that they are going to carry it out, but they want to see how they go about it. So they're delaying, another delaying tactic, and I think it sends the wrong message out there to people that have experienced any sort of sexual assault. So it's only through repetition of these reports that we are really going to get an understanding of the trends that we're experiencing in Ireland, and then we can properly plan and resource the services for victims in this country. That's why the motion calls for a report to be done every 5 years, and I'd ask you all to support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. That was Councillor Deirdre Kingston, who is also our candidate in Dunleary constituency next time out. Is there a seconder for the motion? It's formally seconded. And now we're moving to motion number 37 in the name of Dublin North West Constituency Council. Andrew.
Councillor Andrew Montague from the Dublin North West constituency and candidate for the next general election. I want to tell you about an issue that's happening in my own community and in many communities around Dublin and around the country. And that's the issue of motorbikes being used really to terrorise the community that they're in. This June, on a Saturday night, two of my neighbours, two women in their late 50s, were meeting to go out on a night out, met at the local Centra shop, and they were standing outside the shop when a motorbike mounted the pavement and smashed into them, and they broke multiple limbs, both women. While they were lying on the ground, instead of trying to help them, the perpetrator roared and abused at them to threaten them in case they might ring the guards to get the motorbike seized. So while this was happening, a local drug gang came along, took the bike away and removed all evidence, so by the time the guards came, there was nothing the guards could do to get that bike. And that bike is still in circulation and going around our community on a regular basis. Some of our drug gangs have taken to buying these bikes en masse, and they rent them out. So there's a couple of occasions when I've been walking down the street with my 2-year-old son and my 6-month-old son, where I've come across up to 10 bikes coming towards me on the street, scrambling, doing wheelies, mounting the footpath. Our communities are under terror, they're under siege, and they're screaming out for some help. So what are the guards doing about this? Well, to be honest, the guards' hands are really tied. Logistically, they don't want to chase people who are riding these motorbikes, and they're right, because that will encourage them to go even faster, to become more reckless, and to put more lives in danger. If they do, by chance, get to seize one of these motorbikes, they have to give it back if the person can show proof of ownership of the bike, so they can't hold on to the bike. So these bikes are just staying in circulation, and our community are staying under siege as a result. So, for that reason, I want to give the guards the power to remove these bikes without an automatic right to return. I think if somebody wants to get that bike, they should have to go before a judge and show how they would use that bike responsibly, and let the onus be on the person who's abusing their motorbike rather than on the guards to automatically give it back. And in the context of the terror and the abuse that our communities are under, I don't want to accept the addendum that we should be building motorbike parks to, in a sense, reward the people who are abusing these privileges that they've got. So, in a different context, I think that could be looked at, but I don't want to associate it with this motion to deal with the dangerous behaviour that's going on in my community. So I would ask you to support my motion, but without accepting the addendum. And that addendum, I think, could be looked at in a different context at a different time, but I don't want to associate it with this motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Is there a seconder for the motion? Alison.
Councillor Alison Gilliland, Santry Kilmore in Dublin Bay North constituency. I want to formally second Andrew's motion and also emphasise everything that he has said about the threat of those bikes. I think one in my own constituency in Darndale Park has been featured on the television. It is very much a massive antisocial behaviour, and the guards' hands, as Andrew said, are tied. I'd also like to support his non-acceptance of the addendum. I do think it's a really great idea, and there are communities that would be very open to having those facilities, but they're two very, very separate issues. Thank you.
So now, have we a mover for the addendum in the name of the Oxmanstown branch? Is anybody prepared to risk the row? So, it's formally moved. Percy? Sorry? Is there a seconder? Yes, it's formally seconded. So now, the motions 33, 34 with the addendum, 35, 36, 37 and the addendum are before the floor for debate. Are there any speakers offering? Yes, Robert, come on. Can I ask, please, speakers, people intending to speak in debates, would they come up, please, and sit in the front so that we don't lose any time? Anybody wishing to speak in the debate now, would they please come up and sit here at the front? So I take it then that Robert is the only speaker offering.
Robert Dowds, Clondalkin Rathcoole branch. I want to acknowledge, before I speak, the work that Eamon O'Riordan did when he was a minister with responsibility in the area of immigration. However, there is a great deal to be done, and I just want to make one point in relation to my own area. There is an asylum centre in Clondalkin, and the people there have been told that they have to vacate within a month's time. And there is a big scramble as to try to get alternative accommodation for them. So even when they are in asylum centre, some of them are in a very vulnerable situation. I want to make some broader points, though. I absolutely agree with the motion, but I think we need to broaden this whole discussion. We need to develop a full and proper policy in relation to migrants to this country. And amongst the things we need to provide for migrants is to have a situation where they have access to English classes, and I would regard that as something that's obligatory unless they are already fluent in English. And that on top of that, they should have access to classes on Irish culture, life and practice, because it is really an important thing in terms of people adjusting to life in this country. It can be small things. I mean, I was out with our local Tidy Towns group a few weeks ago, and there was an African woman actually from the asylum centre helping, and she was very gingerly picking up papers with a paper picker from the grass. So I said, "Why are you going so gingerly?" She said, "Oh, I'm afraid a snake might jump up at me." So she didn't know that there are no snakes in Ireland. So, I mean, that's just one small example. There are many, many examples of things. And people need to be given access to that information, and many of those people want that access anyway. But if they are to become, in the end, good citizens of this country, they will benefit, and indeed the economy of the country will benefit from giving those people a leg up. So, in conclusion, I would ask that we would actually set up a small group to develop a policy for immigration and for immigrants to Ireland, because it's something we are not accustomed to dealing with in the past, and it's been left on a laissez-faire basis up to this, and it is not good enough. And there will be considerable problems down the road unless we address this issue properly. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert, but I think you misled that woman by telling her there was no snakes in Ireland. So we've no further speakers offering. I want to invite Deputy Sean Sherlock, Party Spokesman on Justice and Equality, to respond to the debate.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and in order to be helpful to yourself as chair, as I always endeavour to do, I'm conscious of the fact that there are 3 more sections after this, and the television slot is at 11 o'clock. So I propose that we accept the motions that are put here before us today. I would just ask, please, that on 37, I understand where Andrew is coming from on this, but I was hopeful that maybe Andrew's motion would stand as a standalone motion because it is very specific. And if there was some compromise on the addendum, I think that would be very welcome. But I'd be guided by yourselves on that one. And I'm particularly delighted to see the motion in respect of the cost of applying for citizenship, because the cost of 1,125 is exorbitant. And we all know people within our communities, particularly from the UK, who might have been born in the UK but have lived here for many, many a year, working people who cannot afford to spend 1,125 euros to become naturalised. So I particularly welcome that motion, because I think we should do something for those people who have lived and contributed and paid taxes in this country. The least we can do is to make the cost of naturalisation as not prohibitive for those people. Also, in relation to the issue of the direct provision and 34, again, 12 months to me is too short. I will be very frank about that. There is the McMahon report. There are 173 recommendations in the McMahon report, and I think what we need to do is to ensure that those 173 recommendations are absolutely implemented. But also the County Clare Direct Provision Centre, the issue that arose there with that young boy who was denied access to food. Well, I think the simple solution to that is based on common sense, that you have some sort of self-catering provision within every centre to allow for families access as needs be to simple provisions like food as and when is required. And I think that would solve a lot of that as well. So there is a clear issue, though, in relation to the private operators and the protocols that they operate, because what we want to see is a bit of humanity, a bit of decency, a bit of equality, and we need to treat people as human beings and not apply bureaucratic and technocratic solutions to them. Treat people with a bit of decency and humanity, which leads me on to the sound man from Inishbigel, Mr. Holt, who has Mallow connections, I'm delighted to report, and to say that this is an important motion as well. I'm happy to accept that, but I'm also happy to acknowledge the fact that Ireland has not been found wanting in respect of its efforts through the Irish Naval Services, working naval personnel who are saving lives in the Mediterranean. And we have to acknowledge that 1,700 lives were lost at sea since 2018. And this idea that the Aquarius now is having its flag revoked, the last of the private search vessels, is an anathema to what we stand for in terms of, the European Union and what it should stand for in relation to its humanitarian efforts. So there needs to be a consolidated European Union approach to ensuring that you tackle the deflagging issue or the revocation of flags by Gibraltar and Panama and others, and ensure that there is a coordinated political redoubling of the efforts to ensure that no lives are lost at sea. So I'm happy to support these motions. I would just ask, please, for a little bit of latitude for Andrew on the Dublin West Constituency Council motion in relation to the addendum. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Now we're going to vote on those motions. So, motion number 33, all in favour please show. All against. I declare the motion carried. Motion number 34, we have to deal with the addendum first. The addendum has been accepted by the mover. All in favour please show. All against. I declare the addendum carried. And now, motion 34 with the addendum. All in favour please show. All against. I declare the motion carried. Motion number 35. All in favour please show. All against. I declare the motion carried. Motion number 36. All in favour. All against. I declare the motion carried. Motion number 37, and there is an addendum which was moved formally from the floor on behalf of the Oxmanstown branch, which is not acceptable to the movers in the Dublin North West Constituency Council. So they are asking you to oppose it this time. So I'm going to put the addendum first. All in favour please show. All against. Abstentions. I declare the addendum lost. And now motion number 37 without the addendum. All in favour please show. All against. I declare motion number 37 carried. And now we're proceeding to the debate on education and skills. But before doing so, I want to make you aware, delegates, that I am informed by the General Secretary on behalf of the Conference Arrangements Committee that in accordance with standard well-established practice, I will be required to adjourn the debate at precisely 10:40 a.m. in order to facilitate the rearrangement of the platform for the policy debate, which will be going out from 11 o'clock on live television. It's not specifically indicated on the Standing Orders report, but I understand, I know from previous experience, it's standard practice, and I hope you don't challenge me on it, because if you do, the live debate will be about our procedures. So now we're moving to motion number 38 in the name of Dublin Midwest Constituency Council. Mover, please. Thanks, Sean.
Good morning. Eamon Tuffy, Lucan Branch, Dublin Midwest Constituency Council, and I'm proposing the motion on behalf of the Constituency Council. Chairperson, fellow delegates, in proposing this motion, I will speak mainly to the first part of the motion and just refer to the second part. And I'd just like to say three things. 1 in 5 primary and secondary students have some form of learning difficulty. That's a fact. Now, it obviously would vary across a wide spectrum. And parents and children are still experiencing delays, sometimes very long delays of the order of years rather than months, in having their children assessed, either at the stage before entry to primary school or at the stage where they're transferring to secondary school. Now, this delay is still there, even though in 2017 the Department of Education they introduced a new method of assigning special needs assistants and resource teachers and other supports to students with learning difficulties. Basically, they went away from they went to a system where the amount of support in terms of special needs and resource teachers was determined by what was called the profile of the schools. Now, I think it's fair to say, and I've never been a primary or secondary teacher, I think it's fair to say that the jury is out on how well that is working. Because if you happen to be a child, or if you're a parent of a child in an area which doesn't have the profile which will get a fairly good allocation of resources, and you have to have your child assessed, then you can have to wait as well. The motion refers to reducing a bill. Having looked at the legislation that's already in place, and there is quite a lot of legislation in place from the Education Act of 1998. There's an education of children with special needs legislation, there's disability legislation. And by the way, in the disability legislation, in I think it's section 29, that refers to the fact that the HSE is obliged to respond to an application for special reports for a person, but including a young person with a disability within 3 months. Now, that is simply just not happening. In fact, the HSE is in breach of the, basically in breach of the legislation there. Now, I'd just use that point to say that I would leave it to the party spokesperson on education and the PLP to decide perhaps a bill wouldn't be appropriate. There is plenty of legislation there, and as often happens in the case of Ireland, basically it's a question, the dots are not being joined up. Definitely from evaluations of supports in national schools that I've read, formal evaluations, the schools have very much taken on board the requirements of special needs students. The resources are being allocated and the system is working very well and has the full support of the teachers. So I would ask that maybe it's just a question of looking at some of the existing legislation and its enforcement, or it may be necessary to propose amendments. In regard to the second part of the motion, my colleague Robert Dowds has already referred to the fact that people, including children in detention centre, they really have very little supports right across the board. But in particular, in regard to their education, you can think that it must be very difficult living in a detention centre to do your study, etc. And I think and I'll finish on that by formally proposing that. Thank you. I'll take this way down.
The motion number 38 is moved. It's formally seconded. We're moving to motion number 39. And please, delegates, it's 3 minutes to move the motion. I don't want to fall out with anyone, but it's 3 minutes.
Deirdre Kingston, still from the Dunleary constituency. Comrades, Labour has always led from the front in terms of radical education policy. It was our own Minister for Education, Niamh Brenach, who in the 90s opened up third-level education to everybody by abolishing fees. It was our Minister for Education, Rory Quinn, who set up the Forum on Patronage and Pluralism, which led to the growth of multi-denominational schools and further choice in our education system. The next question on radical educational reform is about who governs our schools. When one undemocratic, unelected church body runs over 89% of our schools, we know that there is going to be a problem with accountability. Back in 2012, the Irish people voted to enshrine the rights of the child in our constitution, and although this happened 6 years ago, there has been no attempt by the Department of Education to revise any of the legislation to reflect that vote. It is now time to ensure that the rights of the child is central to how the schools operate and not the patron bodies. So this motion is asking the Department of Education to review the legislation to ensure that the rights of the child are central to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Deirdre. Is there a seconder? Seconder, formally seconded. And now motion number 40 in the name of Waterford Constituency Council. Councillor John Pratt to move.
Councillor John Pratt, Waterford City and County Council. The sole councillor in Waterford, but we're going to change that after the next elections. The motion which I'm speaking on is the provision of a university for the South East, and I'm calling on the Fine Gael government to intervene in any way that will ensure that the provision, to fast-track the provision of the university status for the South East. Currently in the South East we have nearly 9% of the national population, but we only receive 2.4% of investment, capital investment. And we also generate 5.6% of national GDP, but we actually in return receive 9.6 billion of a shortfall. As you know, we currently cannot provide places for in the region of 8,000 people in university in the South East, so we are losing those to other regions, whether internally within the country or outside of the country. And as you know, once young people move, the chances of them returning is very slight, and as a result there's a brain drain from the South East, so I'd like to move this motion.
Thank you, John. Is there a seconder? Formally seconded. Thank you, Bridget. Now, motion number 41 in the name of Listowel Branch.
Luke Crowley Holland, Kerry constituency. Just moving this on behalf of the Listowel branch and my comrade Sean McCarthy, who couldn't be here today. Just in what's been said about keeping it short, the kind of, I suppose it speaks for itself in terms of the success of the Citizens Committee in relation to looking at the 8th and everything, and everything that Deirdre just said in relation to the place of the child in the Constitution. So I'd urge in the important area of primary education that we support this motion. Thank you.
Seconder. Is it formally seconded? Thank you. So now motion number 42 in the name of the Santry Kilmore branch, Dublin Bay North. Alison.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Alison Gilliland, Santry Kilmore, Dublin Bay North. Colleagues, everyone in this room and indeed in broader society recognise the intrinsic value of a full and rounded education and access to lifelong learning opportunities to the holistic development of the individual and the realisation of their talent and potential, and by default the potential of our society. However, not everyone recognises the need to fully fund and resource our education and lifelong learning systems. Too often, many families and workers are denied education and upskilling opportunities because of their financial cost. No more than our health care, full and timely access depends on paying privately sometimes. For example, our primary school system is growing more and more dependent on voluntary contributions from parents to pay basic running costs. Parents with children that have speech and language difficulties or special education needs too often are forced to pay privately for therapists or for education assessment rather than wait for years on an under-resourced public system to deliver. The most vital of materials, school books, must be bought by parents, costing hundreds of euro each year, a real stretch for many parents. Principals, particularly teaching principals, are also stretched, trying, due to the lack of properly secretarial and caretaker supports, to stretch their time and energies. Over the years, our society and economy have seen the progressive impact of Dun O'Malley's free education system and our own Niamh Brannach's free third level education, which sadly I have to put our hands up and say we partially reversed. We, above all parties, are a party of equality of access and opportunity. And like our colleague Dean Carberry said yesterday, we actually know the meaning of it, and it's not a fancy strap line, unlike others. Therefore, colleagues, we must fully commit to a policy of proper free, and by that I mean appropriately funded and resourced, no requirement for voluntary contributions, no having to buy books, materials or equipment, and no registration fees. So a free primary, secondary, further ed, apprenticeship and third level education system for all. Also, in an ever-changing and revolving economy, we must develop and commit to a comprehensive lifelong programme for those in work, those seeking a change in career or those facing job extinction. For example, I'm particularly thinking of workers in the carbon-intensive sector, such as Bord na Móna, and the need for just transition to a clean, green energy environment. To conclude, colleagues, public services are not truly public or accessible or universal if there's a financial struggle attached to them. And neither do they fully serve those needs unless they are fully resourced. Education is no different. I ask you to support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Is there a seconder? Formally seconded. And now motion number 43 in the name of the Hugh Nevin, Ballybrack, Branch Dunleary. Valerie.
Good morning, comrades. Valerie McDermott, Hugh Nevin Branch, Dunleary constituency. The background to this motion refers to a school in our particular area that my children go to, Clonkeen College. It's the only non-feeing boys' school in the area. Back in the summer of 2017, the Christian Brothers, who actually own the land that the school is on, told the board that all the playing pitches, 7 acres of playing pitches, were to be sold. The patron of the board, Erst, did nothing to help the school, and it was left to the actual board of management of the school to go out in their own names and take a High Court case to try and stop that. This was so stressful for these people. Their whole lives, their houses, their jobs, everything was on the line for this. As well as the school having 550 boys, it also had a special needs unit that had been put in the last 3 or 4 years at considerable cost to the taxpayer, plus there had been an 11 million extension, again at considerable cost to the taxpayer, and all of this was being put under threat because all of their pitches were to be sold. Now, thankfully, at the last minute, there was a deal done, and this didn't happen. But it shouldn't have to come to this. The state should be able to step in when school lands which are being used on a day-to-day basis. The kids play hurling, football, soccer, all sorts of sports. The area was open for the community to use as well, so it wasn't just for the school children. And in particular, finally, I'd just like to thank the Labour Party councillors in our local area, Deirdre Kingston, Carrie Smith and Dennis O'Callaghan, plus Aon and Alan, for their support during this time. But I'd like to hope that, comrades, I hope this kind of thing doesn't have to happen again. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. Have we a seconder for motion number 43? Formally seconded. Thank you, Delegate. And motion number 44 now, in the name of Clonsilla Branch, Dublin West. John.
Good morning, colleagues. John Walsh, Clonsilla, Dublin West constituency. Colleagues, the intention of this motion is straightforward. It is to reinstate fully and to restore the position of history as a compulsory subject and a core element of the junior certificate curriculum. And I think I can do no better by starting with a quote from our recently elected President, Michael D. Higgins, who argued in May 2018 that a knowledge and understanding of history is intrinsic to our shared citizenship, and that historical training was vital in allowing people to critically interpret a range of sources and perspectives, and to allow citizens to face a world in which information was disseminated without regard to truth or factual accuracy. And if you need an example of why a wider appreciation of history is important, then look no further than the recent presidential election, where a number of candidates seemed not only to have no understanding of the past, but also not to know what was going on in the present. And the level of ignorance on display about the Constitution, about how and why the presidency was created, about the historical roots of the presidency, and about the kind of office the presidency was simply spectacular. And was almost impossible. The scale of the ignorance was such that it was hard for journalists to interrogate critically. History matters a great deal. It matters for individuals. It matters for our educational system. It's important for our educational system because education cannot simply be reduced to skills. The role of education is not simply to produce workers with appropriate skills, as if people were produced from an assembly line, but to allow people to develop fully their potential as individuals and to give them the full range of abilities which allows them to participate as citizens in a democratic society. History is even more important in the present, and I'll give a couple of very brief examples. In allowing us, for example, to appreciate the true position of Peter Casey as a historical footnote to the extraordinary victory of Michael D. Higgins, and equally important to the great social movement that led to repeal of the Eighth Amendment, and before that to the achievement of marriage equality. History matters as well in seeing Donald Trump in his proper perspective, as a nationalist demagogue whose politics are a dangerous throwback to a bygone era, and whose practice of the politics of resentment is dangerous but is nothing new. So history has never been more important than it is now, and I would say in conclusion, delegates, that history is too important to be left to historians like myself. It's too important to be left to politicians. History is for everyone. I commend the motion.
Is there a seconder for motion number 44? It's formally seconded. Thank you, delegate. Motion number 45 in the name of Tipperary Town Branch. Do we have a mover? Mover. Yes.
Good morning, delegates. My name is Olive Maguire and I'm from the Tipperary constituency. Conflict calls on government to make mandatory the amount of PE hours at primary school to combat rising obesity levels and encourage young people to participate in sport. We are a country with a rising level of obesity, and exercise is crucial for a child's development. Sport is a great way to foster friendships and helps with communication skills. The WHO recommends children and teenagers should get 1 hour of vigorous exercise every day. In Ireland, this is met by just 12% of 12 to 18-year-olds. This is just not good enough. You know, Ireland as a country needs to be reactive, not proactive. Needs to be proactive, not reactive, as has been the case in recent years. We are creatures of habit, and if these habits are not instilled in us at a young age, it is highly unlikely that we will pick them up as adults. We are on a slippery slope to be one of the countries with the highest levels of childhood obesity in Europe. According to Safe Food, a quarter of Irish children are overweight or obese. At primary level, 60 minutes of exercise could easily be made up throughout the day, and with various exercises. PE has proven to improve children's mental as well as physical activity, but with researchers at DCU saying that 36% of 11 to 12-year-olds were below average in simple motor tasks. These fine motor skills should be honed throughout physical activity and development. Their absence could lead to significant problems in later life. Exercise and activity are key solutions, and as a matter of urgency, we need to make mandatory the amount of PE hours in primary school to combat rising levels of activity in our younger generation. I commend the motion to the conference.
Thank you, delegate. Is there a seconder? Formally seconded. Now we have 3 minutes to conclude this debate. 3 minutes. How many speakers are offering? Well, I'm going to take the speakers. Mick?
Good morning, Mick Keegan here, Labour Disability. I want to recommend that we accept what's called now, oh God, I'm lost. Yeah, 38. The one where children need special needs and whatnot. Last night I spoke on early intervention with children with disability. This is another extension that kids who have a disability trying to get into schools, the mainstream schools, need that extra attention, and not just the idea of waiting to be assessed has to, out. They should get it there and then. And that also includes that if they need equipment to help them to primary, second level education, and especially in third level education, an awful lot of people need the equipment. Those who are blind or deaf and whatnot need all that equipment to be able to get them through education. Labour disability is about taking down barriers with people with disability. And the education system, the way it's set up at the present moment, puts barriers unknown to itself. But we want to try and focus that so people understand these barriers are taken down. I hope you accept the motion.
Thanks, Mick. Two minutes, Sean. Give Aidan 1 minute.
Chahir Sean O'Hergoin, Charlie Smith Branch, Kilkenny City. I'll be very quickly. I'm particularly speaking in relation to the Listowel motion on patronage and the need for a discussion on patronage. I think it's very important that this party supports a widespread discussion. We've had white papers, we've had green papers in relation to patronage, but I want to focus on something that I said at previous conferences, and that is, in the meantime, the flawed system for the selection of new schools, which in effect is an X-factor of competition largely run on Facebook at the moment, and in many ways, and there's a very clear case in Senator O'Riordan's own constituency, we are following a huge competition, well-funded competition by a number of patrons. One patron was selected for the selection of the school. 35% of the parents in the area wanted a Gael school, and it took almost 2 years from the time of the original decision for the Minister finally to relent to the wishes of over 500 people for the right of Gael Oideachas. And I'm just going to ask one thing as a party. I respect that we want to see plurality and we want to see changes in the way that our education system is run. But the traditions run very deep, and I think we need to be careful to respect the views and the wishes of all parents to continue with traditions in their own parishes, in their own areas, and to pardon a bad pun, not to place as an article of faith that we automatically support one patron over another, because ETB schools and Gael Scoil under Forest Patrúnachta management are also multi-denominational schools and allow another option to people who have other sets of views.
If there are no other speakers, I now invite Senator Aidan O'Riordan, the party spokesperson on education and skills, to respond.
Chairman and delegates, just some thoughts on Labour Party's position on education and the motions that have been proposed. I believe people want to hear politicians who say it like it is, so then let's say it as it is. A 3-year-old from a poor family has 1/3 the vocabulary of a 3-year-old from an advantaged family. Think of that. 3 years of age. Motion 38 speaks to that. 17.9% of the adult Irish population are functionally illiterate. 1/3 of children leave disadvantaged primary schools with reading deficiencies. Some young offenders in our prison system sign their names with an X. I'm just saying it as it is. The 300 million the government blew in tax cuts could have delivered a free book scheme to every primary and secondary student in the country, widened the clothing and footwear allowance, increased capitation so voluntary contributions will no longer be needed, lowered our class sizes, helped to bridge that gap between those 2 3-year-olds who live in very different Irelands. So let's say it as it is. Taxes pay for things. Tax cheats cheat us all. And tax exiles cheat us all. So we're just saying it as it is. Instead of tax cuts, the government could have made education free, as Motion 42 says, but they didn't. They could have finally ensured job certainty and respect for our SNAs, caretakers and secretaries, but they didn't. They could have made a bold statement about their intent to totally eradicate illiteracy and educational advantage, but they didn't. I'm just saying it as it is. Under this government, the lobby groups control education. The Catholic Church made Fine Gael roll back on their religious instruction commitments in state schools. The private school sector ensured the admissions bill gives greater rights to the children and grandchildren of past pupils. I'm just saying it as it is. And we know who hates the idea of a fair assessment for means for a student grant. Poverty is a thief. It steals childhoods, it steals dreams, it steals the beauty that a child can see in the world. Education is the great liberator. It frees the spirit, the soul and the mind, and Motion 44 and Motion 45 speak to this. Education is not the means by which to produce an economic unit, but the process by which a human being can make the most of themselves and contribute the best of themselves to all that need them in any possible way. Noel Brown waged a war against TB in the 1940s because although people will always get sick, they shouldn't get sick because they are poor. And we know that people will always have reading problems, but they shouldn't have reading problems because they are poor. Literacy must be a national cause. We must make literacy a national cause and deliver on the right to read, and Motion 38 speaks to that. Finally, delegates, we must reconvene the Citizens' Assembly to break the constitutional link between church and state in education, as Motion 41 says. We must make education free because it is a constitutional right, as Motion 42 says. And we must put children at the heart of our education system, not the churches, not the private schools, nor the corporate interests, and Motion 39 speaks to that, because education will liberate us all. Our party is best when we are Labour. Our party is best when we tell it as it is. I support motions 38 to 45.
So now, delegates, thank you, Aidan. We're going to very quickly vote on these motions. So all in favour of motion 38, please show. All against. Motion 38 is adopted. Motion 39, all in favour, please show. All against. Motion 39 is adopted. All in favour of motion 40, please show. All against. Motion 40 is adopted. Motion 41, please show. In favour. Against. Motion adopted. Motion 42, all in favour, please show. All against. Motion is adopted. Motion 43, all in favour, please show. All against. Motion is adopted. Motion 44, all in favour, please show. All against. Motion is adopted. Motion 45, all in favour, please show. All against. The motion is adopted. So we're going to adjourn for a minute, but don't leave the hall, delegates. Thank you.
Okay, well, welcome to the Pembroke electoral area. Here in Beach Hill, right behind me, we have 19 new homes that I have been very heavily involved in. They were approved by Alan Kelly, who delivered the funding, delivered the permission, and in the next couple of weeks, 19 people will move into their new homes. If everywhere in Dublin delivered what we have delivered here in this small estate, there would be about 7,500 new homes in Dublin. It can be done with the right political leadership and the right funding. These are the only homes being built this year in the constituency of the Housing Minister, and they've been delivered by Labour. Labour is delivering housing where people want to live, where it's needed. That's the Labour way.
We're here under the Rathmines Town Hall clock in the Gulliston Centre. This is being vacated, and we in the Labour group made sure that it would not be sold off for development, but developed by Dublin City Council. We're going to have a primary care centre here, and we will have accommodation for 100 units for senior citizens who want to downsize. This is Labour on the job.
This is the Carbrigade Southern Hotel behind me. It's been empty for the last 11 years, boarded up. It's now really used for antisocial behaviour. In Galway City this morning, we have other hotels that are being used for family accommodation, where young children walk through the hotel lobbies in school uniforms. 100 metres from this site is the GMIT, which is calling out for student accommodation. It's important that big sites like this that are boarded up are developed sooner rather than just being set here for developers to actually be able to flip them down the road. And we need to do something about it. And I'm glad that the Labour Party are the ones that are pushing all the time to do something about this.
Here we are in Charlemagne Street, where Labour provided 79 social units. They're 2 and 3 bedroom units with the facilities needed by the local communities. Sports halls, playgrounds. Labour in government provided for the funding for this development.
We're in Athy in County Kildare today, and we're here proving that the Labour Party can provide solutions to the current housing crisis that we have in this country. I'm standing outside a house that was vacant and indeed derelict some 5 years ago. At that time we met with our then Minister for Housing, Jan O'Sullivan, and within a couple of months this house has been turned around into a family home. And not alone this house, but indeed 10 houses in the town of Athy, showing that Labour have a solution. With 8,000 people on the housing list in County Kildare, we cannot wait for private landlords to start building houses on state land. We need solutions now. There are vacant houses in every corner of Ireland, and we as the Labour Party have provided and shown that this can happen. It needs to happen again.
We fixed the economy in Ireland, but that's not much good to anybody if we don't do something about the big social problems that we still have. The biggest one of those is housing, and we need to ensure that we deal with it, and we can deal with it. It can be fixed. We're proposing that using state land with a state-led approach, that we build 80,000 social and affordable homes over the next 5 years, and we've identified a way in which we can find 16 billion euros of state funding to do that. We need to do that because of the housing shortage in this country and because of the numbers that are currently either homeless already or in fear of losing their homes.
We need to ensure that we implement the National Maternity Strategy. For example, we don't have enough perinatal psychiatrists for women who have mental health difficulties during pregnancy. We also need to ensure that women get proper support when breastfeeding. When we send them home from the hospital, we often send them home to very little supports available. We should have lactation consultants free for every woman in the country.
One of the key recommendations from the Scally report into the cervical check screening programme was that women's health issues be given consistent, expert and committed attention within the health service. It's clear from the Scally report that at the centre of the cervical check scandal was a neglectful and paternalistic approach to women's health. We are calling for the full implementation of the recommendations of the Scally report and for funding for these implementations to be immediately ring-fenced.
Sheila Hodges, Michelle Hart,
Sing
Savita
tests for RT back at base.
These are all women
1,
who suffered
2,
and died
3,
because
4,
theology
5,
and ideology
6,
interfered
7,
with what was best
8,
for them
9,
with their
10.
medical treatment.
1,
Theology and ideology
2,
have no place in medical
3,
treatment. These
4,
decisions are for
5.
a woman, her family
Happy?
and her medical team, her doctors and her midwives. If we want to make sure that women's health care is never trumped by theology or ideology, the National Maternity Hospital must remain fully and completely in public ownership and public control.
The HPV vaccine can be a life-saving measure. We are calling for it to be extended for young boys as well as young girls. In Australia, they have virtually eradicated a generation of cervical cancer through proper cervical check screenings and through a world-leading HPV vaccine programme. Ireland could and should do the same.
Periods are a normal part of women's lives once a month. We have to ensure that there are free sanitary products available in every public bathroom throughout the country. It should be the norm. I've kick-started doing something like this through Dublin City Council, where I propose that we have free sanitary products available in our leisure centres and in our swimming pools and in our public libraries.
Can actually take their seats, I'd really appreciate it. If there are people outside the door, could they please make their way in?
When they have their periods, because of the shame associated with it, because of the fear of being cut out, that shouldn't be something that stops young women getting an education.
This year we finally repealed the 8th Amendment.
Sorry, Deirdre Kingston, if you're in the room, could you come to the side of the stage, please? And Dr. Mark Moore.
treated when they need care and treatment from our health service. One of these momentous events was the repeal by the people of Ireland of Article 33.3 of Bunreacht na hÉireann, the removal by the people that was of the constitutional ban on abortion. We in Labour can be proud that we have long campaigned for this. We've been against it, resolutely against it, right back in 1983 when it was first put into the Constitution. And the outcome of that referendum showed that the people were no longer willing to tolerate a measure in their constitution that was so dangerous for women, that impacted on their health, sometimes their very lives, and that was so backward and undemocratic. Comrades, we put that behind us in May in a hugely decisive vote of the people of Ireland. What we haven't put behind us are some of the attitudes and the obstacles that still prevail for women in our health services. Because the second momentous event this year, or series of events this year, also touching very much on women's health and about how women are treated, concerned cervical cancer. That controversy showed that while we may have progressed, and we have progressed in so many ways in this country, we have a long, long way to go in others. Much of what we have learned this year has been deeply disturbing and deeply troubling, and it calls for decisive action. To frame our discussion on this topic, we're going to talk in a few minutes to a number of remarkable people, individuals who by their bravery and their tenacity have brought these issues squarely before the Irish people. And you'll have seen one of our guests, Vicky Phelan, receiving an award yesterday in Waterford, but we thought that we too, as a party, would like to honour her and her colleagues, and I'll come to that shortly just in a few minutes, and we'll talk about an award that we would like to make. But I'm first joined by Sinead Ahern, who is the outgoing chair of Labour Women, known to you all. Give her a big welcome. And Sinead, I want to ask you, first of all, just about the award itself, because Labour Women have this award, the Joe Cox Award, named after the UK Labour, the murdered MP in Britain. Just tell us a little about the award itself and what it is.
I suppose Jo Cox was an extraordinary activist throughout her life. She showed an amazing commitment to speaking out for people who are vulnerable throughout her entire career, both as an activist, as chair of the UK Labour Women's Network, and later as an MP. And I suppose what we wanted to do with this award was not only to continue the memory of Jo's work and to keep her spirit with us, but also as a way of honouring some of the absolutely extraordinary activism that we see here in Ireland. And we use it as an opportunity to highlight the work of people that we feel have made an absolutely outstanding and exemplary commitment to activism, to improving the lives of others in their community. And that's why we've conceived of this award, so I'm delighted to be here today to present it.
And really, there could not be more deserving recipients of this award than our guests this morning. Two of the three that we were hoping to have with us, we're delighted to have Vicky Phelan and Stephen Teep, ladies and gentlemen. Before we do that, let me also. I'm going to ask you to do that again now in a moment. We're also joined by Alan Kelly, TD, our spokesman on health, this morning, who's also obviously been very active, very closely active in this entire issue during the year. But before we do that, and you beat me to it with your round of applause, and I'm not surprised because I think the individuals that we're talking about here have been, so celebrated across the country. As I said, most recently yesterday in Waterford, in Vicky's case, I saw Stephen on the television last weekend, a very moving, a very compelling interview about his experience. And we know that the experiences of individuals are really the way that we understand difficult and complex questions that face us all as a community. And the experience that they have related in such an articulate way and in such a compelling way, I think has really moved many, many people in this country. So what I'm going to ask Sinead, before I talk to our guests, what I'm going to ask Sinead to present the Jo Cox Award and to ask you to acknowledge once again your recognition of these great people.
Sorry. That way. Thank you so much for everything you've done. It's amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for everything you've done, Vicky. You've been absolutely incredible.
Sit. Okay.
Welcome.
Vicky, I'm going to ask you first of all. As I mentioned, the sideboard at home might be heaving at this stage with awards that you've very deservedly had from around the country. This room is full of political people who've joined a political party because they feel motivated to change the country, change the world that they live in. They decide to get involved in politics. But in your case, I suppose in Stephen's case and Lorraine's case, and Lorraine Walsh, we're hoping that Lorraine might join us. In fact, I was told a few minutes ago her plane was on the tarmac in Shannon Airport, so she's very much invited. We're hoping to have her here, and if she does, perhaps she can join us. But in all of your cases, you didn't really choose activism, or activism chose you. Isn't that the case?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was never even involved in politics in college. I was more the sporty type back in college, and I was the book nerd, as he calls me. And I never would have, I suppose if somebody had told me 6 months ago I'd be doing this, I'd have laughed probably, really. I said, not a hope. I wouldn't be, I mean, if I had thought I'd be sitting up on a stage talking to a room full of people, politicians, I think I'd have laughed you out of the room, So it's not something that I would have selected, no more than yourself, I'd say, no. Stephen, but, I suppose I felt compelled once I came out with my story. And I mean, at the stage, when my court case happened, I only knew that there were 10 other women. That was as many as I knew that there were. I mean, we now know there's far more than 221 even. But once I broke my story, I suppose there's no other way for me to describe it except to say that I felt compelled that I had to keep doing this, and I will keep doing it until we get more accountability, change. I have a 13-year-old daughter. She just had her first dose of the HPV vaccine a couple of weeks ago. And I suppose I was driven all along by the fact that I thought I was going to die. So, there's nothing better than a death sentence, really, to make you want to make sure things happen, and you really don't care what you have to do to achieve that. So that was my reason.
Because that's an interesting point, because you do it out of a motivation that comes from within yourself in terms of your own dilemma. But the really striking thing, and it comes out in the Scally report, which he says about you, and it's very compelling in the Scally report, that actually, and I'll ask Stephen about this as well, and I think people will praise you in terms of the approach, the fact that you've been willing to go so public, having previously been such private people, I would assume. But it's the selflessness of it, I think, that people are really admire. So you've got to look after yourself, your own health, your own family, your own future. And this is kind of where it becomes political, maybe with a small p. It's the really compelling thing about it is how selfless, because you want to actually do it for others rather than just for yourself. And it comes through in Scally very strongly.
I suppose it comes from my background. I work in education, and I work in adult education, and I suppose I've just transferred working with people who, were failed by our education system, because I work with adult learners, to transferring that to working with people who have been failed by our health system. So, I have a history, I suppose, of working with people who don't have a voice and who haven't been able to use that, and I can. So, I've just transferred that to a different agenda, really, I suppose, on a bigger scale than I ever imagined.
Sure. One of the things that Lorraine Walsh said was, it really stuck with me, a quote from her where she said, "I can't change the past, but I can change the future."
Yeah.
And again, it's like we would see that as very much a kind of a political sort of motivation that we would have on a broader level, that we see things that are wrong, we want to try and change it for other people in the future. So, Stephen, how's it been for you? I mean, as I said, I saw you on the television last weekend. I'm sure a lot of people did, in a really, really strong interview, very obviously personal as well, but also the motivation that we're talking about here of let's make it better and let's ensure it doesn't happen again.
Well, that's what it's all about for me. It's about, I suppose, from the very beginning, it's about trying to explain a story to two small guys when they're old enough to understand. When Irene passed away, my two little boys were 4 and 2. They're 5 and 3 today. they're nowhere near old enough to understand why their mother died. But when they are of age, it's going to be a different story, because now we've been dragged into this scandal. The story will be, you know, explaining what happened to their mother, but it's going to be about everything that I suppose Vicky blew open in regards to everything we know now today with what went on. But the question that's always going to be asked of me when I do explain it to these boys, because I'm the one raising them, they will be asking questions like I do, will be, what did you do about it when you found out about this scandal? There's two options: do nothing or do something, and that's where, for me, there was only one answer to that question: do something. It is, of course, finding out the answers of what went wrong, making people accountable where we can. But I think the most common thread between Vicky, I, and myself, Lorraine, and many of the other families in this is repairing what did go wrong, so this doesn't happen to anybody else like it happened to us. I do not want to see another widower like myself on stage.
And on that score, I think you both welcomed the Scally report. And actually, I sat down and read the report during the week, and it really is worth reading as a report, you know, beginning to end. I'm not a scientist, or most of us wouldn't understand some of the technical detail in there, but it repays reading the report, because it's a chronicle of what happened. And the recommendations are so strong. I think you both said that, perhaps with some understandable scepticism maybe at the outset in terms of reports. We've seen so many reports. But this is a report with real content to it, isn't it, in terms of the recommendations?
Like, I think what we were expecting was this report just to be a list of problems, and that's it. And that was the fear. I think we were both, Lorraine as well, when we first sat down with Gabriel and went through it, like, pleasantly surprised that not only did it list out the problems, but it listed out 50 recommendations as well, some of which will instantly improve the screening programme today. And that's what we need to achieve. It's about reinstalling trust back into this screening programme, but of course highlighting the mistakes while also fixing them. And to see those 50 recommendations straight away gave us something to now work towards achieving, and that's implementing them sooner rather than later.
And Alan, I'm sure you would agree that those recommendations, from the political perspective now, in the coming period, that's where this is at, is the implementation of those recommendations.
Absolutely. The most important thing, and you know, obviously I speak with the lads a lot, Steve and Vicky and many others, but the most important thing is we will eventually have to find answers as to what happened, but it's all about the future. What is so inspiring, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, about the two individuals to my right is everything they do, they're doing for future generations. It's all about the 50 recommendations. It's all about the implementation. It's all about future vaccination. It's all about future screening. It's all about the advent, which we in the Labour Party are very strong on, in relation to HPV vaccination, in relation to HPV testing. It's all about the future. It's about the extension to boys, so we can create herd immunity. And that's why these are two amazing people, so deserving of this award, because all their campaigning is all for the future generations, and that's why they're such inspirational people.
Sure. And just lastly, Vicky, obviously we remember Emma Vic Fahuna as well this morning, and she obviously passed away during the summer and would have also have been very prominent in all of this. I made the point at the start, when we were opening up, that we're talking about women's health. So we're talking about it on the broader canvas of women's health. Cervical cancer is one hugely important. Just, the Scally report strikes me, it opens up that broader agenda of women's health. How women are treated, attitudes towards women, obstacles that women have, particular social economic impact on women more than on men for a lot of things in our broader society. Would you agree with that? That Scally kind of, he deals with cervical cancer, but he makes it into a bigger set of questions for all of us.
Yeah, he does, absolutely. And I think that's something that I have been very vocal about from the very beginning, which is why I was so, open and quite graphic at times, I suppose, about, what cervical cancer actually means when you're living with it and the type of side effects that you have. that a lot of the medical profession just kind of expect you to get along with. One of the biggest side effects that women are probably, a lot of women are very embarrassed to talk about are the psychosexual side effects. I mean, up to 50% of marriages break down as a result of cervical cancer, because it's very difficult to enjoy sex again, basically after a cervical cancer diagnosis. You go into early menopause. This is happening to very young women. And a lot of these side effects are really brushed over when you finish your treatment. They focus on really, the chemotherapy, the radiation, and, coming back every 3 to 6 months for checkups. But they really don't go into the emotional and the psychological impact that the cancer has had on your life. And I think that is, to me, tends to be the way women are treated in general with regard to their gynecological health in this country. So I suppose I felt when I started talking about this more openly on radio and in interviews, that it gave voice to women who are afraid to do so. So I think the more we do that, the better we will be for it, and the more change will come about as a result of it.
Okay, in a moment, Aoife Nihulavon is going to pick up on some of those issues with our Labour colleagues, but I just want to thank you once again, Vicky, Stephen, Alan, Sinead, for joining us. Give them all a great welcome. Aoife. Aoife.
Thank you, Alex, and congratulations to Stephen, Vicky and Lorraine, who's not with us right now. I have Mark Murphy, who's beside me right here now. Dr. Mark Murphy, I'm going to give you a chance to come in on some of the issues that we discussed, but I know that you want to talk about women's access to healthcare.
Thanks, Aoife. So I'm really struck by a theme that we have to think about the past, but we must be future and solution focused. And I think this year is all about women's healthcare. This is the year in May where we repealed the 8th Amendment, and Labour had such a huge part in that movement over 30 years. That's a huge harm that the state inflicted on Irish women, and we've removed that, and we have to think about the future. We've seen this year with the cervical check controversy and some of the words used and described in the Scally report. It's not good enough, and we have to be future focused. And I think I am part of a medical profession that have failed women in the past, and we all need to step up, and we are committed to providing a women-centred service in the future. So in terms of abortion care, it's 5 months since the referendum, and it's 2 months until a world-class abortion service was promised for Irish women. And I don't think actions are happening fast enough. We need to implement this service. We need to legislate. We need to remove those restrictive words that have been coming and sneaking into the legislation. And we need to support providers. I'm going to be providing abortion services, and I want to do that in 2 months' time. And we need to support those healthcare providers. And in terms of cervical cancer, we've heard just the wonderful advocacy from Vicky and Stephen. We need to extend the HPV vaccine to boys. It's a no-brainer. HICWA have agreed to that. And I would say cervical cancer is such a serious condition, and it's really important that the women of Ireland, once you become 25, you need to register with cervical check and go to your practice nurse and GP and get screened. I would also say that in terms of access to healthcare, women have a hard deal. In terms of accessing general practice, over half the population have to pay for primary care and general practice. That's not right. And women are disproportionately affected. They require contraception. There are issues to do with reproductive and sexual health care, the menstrual cycle, and they will have to attend general practice, and they have to pay to see me, and that's not right. It's not right. And when they're seeking access to secondary care, there are some other gynecological malignancies like ovarian cancer, and to pick up ovarian cancer, we need early diagnosis. I need access to ultrasound scans, and that's not there. So there are major challenges, but we are solution focused and future focused, and we need to think about that, what type of public service that we can deliver, and particularly for women's healthcare, because we've really failed in the past, and we have to be mindful of that past.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to go to Councillor Deirdre Kingston. I know that you had a council motion on breastfeeding that you wanted to speak to us about.
Yes, well, I had a motion to Dún Laoghaire County Council in terms of supports for parents, really, and supporting new parents in the workplace, particularly in the council. And it was basically to bring in further supports for breastfeeding, you know, if you have to breastfeed in the workplace, that there is an area that you can go to, and that there would be just some support measures brought in for counsellors that are new parents, because unfortunately there is no leave for counsellors who become new parents. So you're expected to turn up to your meeting, even if it's the night, you know, that the day that you have your baby, you're expected at a meeting that night. So I think that needs to change in legislation. But while we're waiting for that, we need councils to acknowledge that parents need a little bit more support.
That's excellent. Thank you very much, Deirdre. And we are going to hand over to Alex now.
Okay, Sinead, the folks there have been talking just about what the lessons are for what we've learned during the year. Labour Women, as I say, we have this policy statement and policy document. What are the priorities? And we'll stick with the cervical cancer because that's our focus just for the moment. But what, in addition to that, are the kind of priorities that Labour Women believes that the party should be campaigning on in this area?
I think that's probably where the Labour Party policy is maybe different to what might be proposed by other parties, in that we're talking about well-being and respect. So we're talking about health, not just in the context of access to medical care, high-class facilities, which are all very, very important, but also a healthcare system that's founded on respect. Respect for people's information, respect for sharing that information, respect for people's autonomy around making decisions around healthcare, and also around well-being. So understanding that mental health services, physical health services are very, very important, but they're important in the context of a well society, a society where people have decent jobs, decent accommodation, that they're not stressed out wondering where the next meal is coming from. So it's really about that. It's about respect at its core, and improving services with that basis.
And Stephen, bringing it back to your experience and Irene's experience, that would seem to resonate, that point about respect. That was something that you were looking for, and you were looking for respect and recognition for your position.
Yeah, like I think when it comes to that, I suppose the conversation around disclosure and the information that Irene had asked for many times, you know, she said I'd done everything right, I'd gotten my smears done, how wasn't this picked up? Never was it once said, you know, that information we can find out for you and we can share with you. In fact, they got the information before she passed away and made the decision to withhold that information from her. Not only withhold it from her, but 3 months after Irene passed away, they made a second decision, and that was to withhold that information from myself also. The biggest, I suppose, the most painful thing about that is how they disrespected Irene, particularly after almost 2 years of fighting, 2 years of basically handing her life over to the system, to those healthcare professions, to those consultants. We were in awe of them. We thought they were the greatest people there was, and then for them to turn around and disrespect my wife in the way that they did is one of the, I suppose, things in this that makes me most angry, particularly when it's written in black and white what to do if someone is so sick or even dying. If your information comes to light, that the policy is there in black and white and it was just blatantly ignored. In the words of Irene's consultant, I dropped the ball. That's not good enough. It just isn't.
So, what you're saying there is that it's as much about keeping to the protocols and keeping to the policies as it is about having new ones.
Absolutely. You know, as a doctor pointed out to me, you know, medicine isn't an exact science. That's why they say they practice medicine. It should be a two-way street. Transparency between both parties. It's almost like a partnership. And it's all about respect is at the core of this, along with trust. And yeah, it's very important. Very, very important.
Well, I mean, half the problem was the policy at the time was voluntary open disclosure, you know what I mean? And obviously a lot of the medical professionals, particularly in the case of the cervical check, women, you know, decided for themselves who needed to be told and who didn't. I mean, in my case, I found out, my gynaecologist did tell me, but it took him 15 months to, you know, of wrangling over and back, emails between himself and the director of cervical check about who was going to tell me. because he didn't want to and she didn't want to, but they took 15 months to decide that. But she wanted him to tell 3 of the 10 women that were in his care, and he decided, in fairness to him, to tell all 10. But, those decisions should not be left up to individuals. There's a policy there, it should be adhered to. That's why we're really adamant about making sure that this mandatory open disclosure policy is implemented to the nth degree and that there are sanctions on individual health practitioners.
I'm just struck one of the points that Scally makes is, and maybe it's a good point to end on, he talks about the need to engage and enable the public to take an active interest in their own health, making healthy choices and building healthy communities. And he says that's essential to achieving public health goals, as well as contributing to socially sustainable health systems that reduce health inequities. So what you're talking about in terms of the respect and the importance of disclosure, particularly in the case of women. There would be issues in the case of men as well, but particularly in the case of women in the situation that you've described, that's actually at the heart of it. So the respect has to go both ways, and engagement and people being agents about their own health, they still do need the support and the backup of the system itself. Yeah. So once again, folks, will you thank our guests for being with us this morning? I should have asked you, Vicky, how are you? You're obviously well. Yeah, that's good. I can see
Yesterday's makeup is still
on. We can all see that. Yeah. Thank you once again.
Hey!
Now, Aoife, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Aoife.
Thank you, Alex. So our next panel will be discussing abortion services, repeal the 8th. But I just want to come back on something that you said, Dr. Murphy, earlier. In terms of implementing these services in Ireland, we know the World Health Organization published some information recently on the challenges that countries face. Are there unique challenges here in Ireland for us? How are we going to deal with this?
Abortion is a reality in the reproductive lives of women in every country in the world. And Ireland is behind the curve. But we have an opportunity to be future and solution-focused. We can learn from the problems that other countries had. And I think two of the key enablers that have promoted world-class and evidence-based, women-centred services are political leadership from the very top. And I think some credit has to go to Minister Simon Harris in his campaigning. But equally, we have to enable healthcare practitioners, and we have to promote that culture. And 2 months out from providing services, I think there are questions for both of those aspects. From a legislative aspect, and I'm not a legislator, we know that needless restrictions are creeping into this legislation. We should have exclusion zones in that legislation to protect women when they're walking into hospitals and into their clinics. There are issues that the same healthcare practitioner has to be present to provide all aspects over a week, and that doesn't pay heed to the normal human resources in hospital settings or in primary care settings. And contraception. Women need free contraception. And that was not part of this service, and that was promised in the Joint Oireachtas Committee. So we have to be honest about those mistakes. They're not there. But we also have to then create the clinical guidelines, and there are obstetricians and GPs and experts that are doing that at the moment and working very hard. And we also need to resource it. We must resource. If the resources don't follow, well, really, there isn't really a commitment to right the wrongs of the past. So they're all the challenges that I see. But I think we absolutely need political leadership right now, and the Labour Party has that leadership. And I think we also need to really empower healthcare providers who are committed to providing care, and we really need to enable and support them.
Okay, on that, we will hand over to our panel. Thank you, Alex.
Okay, we have some new people to meet. Thank you, Aoife. Louise Kenny, Professor Louise Kenny is right here. Kathleen Lynch, you all know, my former colleague and our wonderful Cork North Central candidate in the next general election. Jerry Burke, also a party colleague of ours, obstetrician in Limerick, and Louise Caffrey, right down the end of the panel there, is an assistant professor of social policy in Trinity. Louise Kenny, I was going to come to you first, and I'm going to ask a very sort of obvious question, and perhaps a naive one, and for a man, not a very safe one. But nevertheless serious. Why would there, and why should there be a concentration on women's health? Because we want a better health service for all of us. What are the particular issues that give rise to the need for a concentration in public policy on women's health?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think we need to concentrate on the health service in the round. But the reason why we are so passionate about focusing on women and children is because traditionally, historically, in other parts of the world, it is often the case that women and children always fall to the bottom of the health agenda. And that's been shown the world over. As soon as there is competition for budgets, women and children's health falls down the pecking order. There are numerous reasons for that. Many of the conditions that women get, like pregnancy, some of the gynecological conditions, they don't end up on trolleys in A&E every winter. So there isn't a trolley crisis. There isn't a political imperative to fix things that don't make the headlines. And so because of that, women and children are vastly behind the curve. And if you look at, for example, the infrastructure in which we currently provide care for pregnant women in this country, it's Victorian, it's Dickensian in its nature. And that investment is very much needed and very much late. So I think that's why we have the focus, that's why we're so passionate about focusing on women and children, because historically there has been a neglect in that area and we're vastly behind the curve.
Kathleen, would you agree, and from your experience as a minister and from your knowledge of the system, obviously particularly disability and mental health, but also the broader question?
Well, I do think that at the end of the day, it is the women that nag everyone else about their health. You know, it's about, you need to get that checked out, and yet not taking a great deal of notice of our own health. And there are particular conditions that are unique to women, I think, as everyone knows. But we do our very best to ensure that our children are healthy, that our partners are healthy, that our general family in a wider sphere is healthy, whilst we don't take that much notice of our own health. And I think that the unintended consequence of introducing the under sixes free GP care, which we did in government, is that parents now have to go to the GP because they're going with their child that they assume is sick, and maybe they're in need of a little bit of reassurance, and maybe the child needs to be dealt with, but they're in there as well. And I think that's one of the unintended consequences that actually has had a good effect on women and their health, because, you know, while the child is being undressed and being checked out by the GP, then, you know, women are inclined to talk more than men, as you've probably noticed. But, you know, it is about saying, you know, I'm very worried about, you know, one thing or another. And in that respect, it actually brings into being their mental health as well. And women do worry, I think, more than men. Of course, there are exceptions. I'm not saying there aren't, but there are exceptions. But women do worry about how to hold the family together, you know, how the household is running. And you know, they do, to a great extent, feel that they are the people that needs to support everyone else. And I think from that point of view, we need to take a serious look at how women look after their own health. I do think as well, though, and I will stop on this point, that whilst we're looking at, I suppose, access and the different types of conditions that women have and why we don't access as much as we should, I think what we are forgetting as well is that there is not just a gender element of this, but there is most definitely a class element to health as well. And I think if we produce a health document as the Labour Party that is only gender-based and doesn't take class into consideration, class, levels of education, information, how that's accessed, how we understand it, then I think we will be failing a whole section of society.
Thanks, Kathleen. And just to note as well the presence of our party leader in the audience this morning with us, Brendan Howlin, TD. Sherry, you're both a party colleague and a practitioner in obstetrician in Limerick. How do you see these issues, particularly in the context of women's health? And
so I'm particularly interested in the business of having babies. And I'm sure you'll agree that for human beings in general, there's nothing more important than having a baby. And having the baby safely, getting a good outcome and having a very positive experience. There's nothing more positive than a baby. It's very important work. And I have to commend politicians in general, not just from this party, but in general, the approach to some of the events that have happened in the last 10 years have been, there's been very strong political reaction. And they've started to put in place mechanisms to deal with the issues. For example, the National Maternity Strategy, the abortion referendum. These were driven by politicians. The public were involved as well, of course, but it required a big political involvement. In the National Maternity Strategy, there are some very important items. For example, perinatal mental health, a very neglected subject.
Yes.
And it's something that, we got 77 recommendations out of this strategy. And in Limerick, it fell to me to make a priority list. So I picked a safety one, which is very, very important. The prevention of neonatal brain injury. If we can eradicate or at least reduce that by half, as Britain is trying to do as well, very, very major impact for individual families, but also for costs. And the second thing that I prioritised, and we rolled it out earlier this year, is a perinatal mental health service. So, mental health issues are commonplace, and they're commonplace in the pregnant and postnatal population. So it's very important that the politicians actually drove this document and that it has been backed up with investment, and we've seen investment. So I'm grateful to politicians for this because, politicians can save a lot more lives than Louise and I can, ever. So the Minister for Health, that's a really, really important job.
Okay. Louise Caffrey, I mentioned at the start of our session that really the two events, and I was supposed to have drawing maybe a tenuous link between the repeal of the 8th and the cervical cancer controversy. And of course, they're two different things, but they're, in many ways, they come back to the same or similar set of issues for women in particular. So we've had the repeal, and we now have the legislation starting to go through the Houses. What do you see as being the big priorities there in terms of the services and the implementation of the services for women across the country?
I suppose, first of all, the issue is to get the legislation passed, because, of course, despite the landslide result in the referendum, nothing has actually changed at the moment for women and their partners. So women are still being forced to go to other countries' health services to access abortion services. Women are still most likely taking abortion pills without medical supervision in Ireland. So a priority is absolutely to get that legislation passed as quickly as possible and then to implement it. But of course, a right in law is not the same as a right which you can necessarily access and practice. And I think that's where the focus has to be. And it's really important that in the process of passing this legislation that we think through all of the possible ways in which we can make sure that these rights are accessible. So some of the big issues are, for example, around conscientious objection, which is something that's been talked about quite a bit, that doctors, we've heard, are likely to have a right to conscientious objection in the bill. And in a way, so that of course is the right that if you're a doctor who disagrees morally with abortion services, that you don't have to provide those services. And in a way, that in itself isn't necessarily problematic, but it can impede access if it's not dealt with properly. So some ways of dealing with it might be to provide lists of doctors who are willing to provide services so that women can safely navigate to providers who are willing to provide those services. But within that, of course, it's really important as well that there are referral processes and that those referral processes are timely and they're governed by strict guidelines around the doctors referring very, very quickly to service providers who are willing to provide those services. And that there need to be implications, of course, consequences if that referral process isn't done within those strict guidelines. But both of those ways of dealing with the issue, in some ways, place the onus on service users to access, to enable their right to abortion services, because it means that the service user has to navigate those lists, they have to navigate a referral process. Another way of doing things might be to think about placing the onus on the service provider, in this case the state, to enable that right, to enable access. And something that the state could potentially look into is mandating that hospitals and perhaps GP practices have a certain number of doctors who are willing to provide abortion services. And if we find that we currently don't have enough, then perhaps the next time those jobs come up, we could mandate that those jobs include providing abortion services.
Louise Kenny, from your experience in the UK system, obviously you know both systems. Have we lessons to learn, or have we things to avoid, or what would you say?
I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that since we repealed the 8th in May, the Liverpool Women's Hospital, where I now currently work, has treated more than 50 women who have travelled because of fatal fetal abnormality. And that's just one hospital, and in fact there were women booked to attend the Liverpool Women's next week. So there is an urgency around introducing this legislation, but in that urgency I don't think we should rush and get it wrong. We have a chance to provide something that truly is world class, and some elements of the proposed legislation really concern me. In the UK at the moment we are trying to actually decriminalise abortion completely. We're trying to make it a much more liberal act, decriminalise all aspects of abortion, and it's been a passionate objective of our current chair of the Royal College to do that. Here in Ireland, we're actually now talking about some proposed legislation that will actually, I think, potentially limit abortion for those women who are most vulnerable. So, for example, the need to have a 3-day wait. I think that's patronising. By the time a woman sees her health... By the time a woman sees her healthcare provider, be it a doctor or an obstetrician, to request a termination of pregnancy, she has thought about it to the end of the world and back. She doesn't need to wait another 3 days. That wait will harm the women who are most vulnerable and most marginalised, the women who've taken everything that they can to pluck up the courage because they're a victim of rape or domestic abuse, to be told, great, go away and come back in 3 days. It's really harmful and it's patronising, and I think that should be struck out of the legislation.
Okay. There, we'll try to maybe come back to some of those questions in a minute, but for the moment, Aoife, I think you have some other people there to talk to.
We heard some discussion there on access to mental health services, and Letty McCarthy, you wanted to talk about children's access to mental health services and when the child turns 18.
I did, Aoife, and thank you very much. And if I may briefly, just to follow up on this, where we're talking about mental health or we're talking about women's health, GPs in my area are telling me there is a waiting list of 10 to 12 months for ultrasounds in our local hospitals. And, excuse me, if you just think about that, 10 to 12 months is completely unacceptable for people to have to wait that length, and we do need to do something about that. And in terms of mental health, and once they become 18, and I'm sure everybody here in this room, you don't need to be a politician, I'm sure you all know families who have children with physical or mental disabilities, and it's hard enough to find services for them during their age. We know many families who have spent their lives fundraising, and that is so cruel and that is so wrong that we expect families to do that because they haven't access to schools or to a proper education for their youngsters. But once they get to 18 years of age, they are literally handed back to their parents. The parents are 20 years older, and you know, where is the stimulation for that youngster? An 18-year-old that finishes school, that can go to college, go travelling, go abroad, go working, all of those things. But somebody with the disabilities that I was speaking about this morning in my motion, those opportunities are not open to them, and we need a service that can provide that. Apparently there is a budget there if you can navigate through that, but that should not be the job of the parents, the families and the carers. That should be the job of the state, where they can go and say, right, this is what we have in place for your young person so they can live a proper life and that they have access to good quality of life. And I really want to see us as a Labour Party pursuing that for the sake of all of those families.
Okay, thank you, Letty. We'll hand back to Alex.
Kathleen, respond to that. There are issues that you're very familiar with.
Very familiar with, and basically what happens when a child reaches 18, it is always astonishing to me that the end of June, end of July always comes as a surprise to the service provider. When we were in government, it happened one year, and then I said, look, in February of every year we will know exactly who's coming out of that system. And what are we going to do about it? So what we did was we kind of did as if it were third level applications. And, the people coming out of the system, we knew where they were, we knew what could be provided, and there wasn't enough to be provided, but nevertheless no one was without a particular service. But what struck me during all of that, and I think where the Labour Party needs to be going, is that the service on offer from the service provider. And, service providers are doing a job since the 30s, 40s, 50s that the state refused to do. It's as simple as that. And so we shouldn't condemn them for that. But what they have on offer when children exit, if you like, second level, is what's on their menu, rather than what's necessary or what the person themselves would like. So there is no choice. Here's our menu. What would you like to do? Come into our service and this is what we will provide you with. Rather than taking a look at the individual, saying what's best suited to their needs. And that's really where we were working towards, that kind of individualisation that allowed people to have as good a life as you can, because none of us have the perfect life. But we should allow other people as well to have as good a life as you can. And that is what's important about disability, and not one size fits all. And we need to start recognising that. Now, I do know that the government has a committee in place on individualisation and individual payments. I think it'll probably be a pilot programme. I think it'll be a long way down the road. But to meet that, we really need to start saying to the service providers who get paid in a block grant, I have X amount of people, this is how much you're going to get. We really need to start saying to them that you need to change your practice too.
Okay, there are a number of other issues I want to come back to our guests on, but Aoife, I think there are two other people with you there who have things to say very close on point here.
Míle baiachas, Alex. Yeah, I have Shauna Ruddick here beside me. Shauna, you wanted to speak to us very quickly about women's mental health.
Yeah, I suppose the first thing I'd like to say is how I know that for the future, but how incredibly inspiring they are, that they are having a huge impact on the present. I know everyone who has listened to them would have felt that, and I think having listened to Vicky, her story in terms of how she was dealt with, her mental and psychological needs, it wasn't even an issue. There simply are no services there, and that's what I'm seeing the whole time. I think we can't underestimate them as role models in terms of changing the conversation around the need for mental health provision in every way. And from what I see, it's badly, badly needed, and it has to become a political issue.
Okay, thank you very much. And I've Verna McGovern. McGowan, when we talk about mental health services, of course, one thing we need to take into consideration is violence against women and access to these types of services and how important they are. How are we doing right now?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it's just been an honour to share a stage, with Vicky and Stephen and others. And what struck me, I worked for many years for a leading human rights organisation at European level. They're human rights defenders, they're agents of change. The ground is shaking beneath us in Ireland with the women who took to the streets, for the repeal. But the bigger question, and the onus of all of us, entering the political world, is why do we need such personal tragedies to spur change? We need systemic, long-term vision, so those systems don't do that. A second brief point that links on that is to say that we can talk about different aspects of gender health and from a human rights-based approach again, but until we have universal health care, it's almost pointless to talk about that. the determinants of well-being, they're to do with your socioeconomic status, they're to do with your shelter, your housing, all of those things. So we need to really broaden that conversation. Indeed, on violence against women in particular, and again, maybe coming from a European perspective, I find it astounding that in Ireland, a country that abroad champions itself on human rights, still hasn't ratified the Istanbul Convention. And why that's important, and a number of speakers have mentioned that, is that focuses also on the psychological harm and the need not just for the legal, I guess, safeguards, but really changing that culture that doctors ask the right questions, that the right services in place, and that even our judges and frontline defenders are there to really give a holistic approach to the well-being and health of women in Ireland. And that's really what I would like to emphasise, is that holistic approach going forward.
Thank you very much, Averna. And back over to you, Alex.
Margaret, Aoife, on that point, that holistic point, and Jerry, you sort of touched on it there when you were talking about politicians and the impact politicians can have. And I know when I was a Minister of the Department of Health, the thing that strikes you always is that you can't really talk about health just in the context of health policy, because the broader context of social and economic circumstances that people find themselves in, the pressures that they're under, particularly women we're talking about this morning, they always have to be factored in and always have to be understood as part of the necessary policies. So it isn't just about the health issues, it isn't just about the doctors, the medics, it's also about an understanding of where all these problems come from. Would you agree with that, Louise?
Absolutely, yeah. If you think about the social context in which repeal was set, the women that we were advocating for, particularly women who were living on the margins of society, victims of domestic abuse, violence in the home, victims of rape, fixing access to a healthcare procedure is just the tip of the iceberg. Prevention goes so much deeper to the heart of society and fixing the fabric of society that has caused those issues. Absolutely.
Okay. Jerry, I suppose it's really just a development of the point you're making yourself, isn't it? But as a doctor, as a practitioner like Louise, do you see those? Obviously, you see the circumstances that people are in, but does it factor into the kind of care that you can give people?
Of course it does. I mean, when I went to Limerick first 26 years ago, I was completely appalled by the amount of poverty that I saw in my clinic. There have been social interventions and improvements in that quarter of a century, and it is much better, I have to say. It's not as bad as it was. But we tend to concentrate on the biomedical aspects of health, and a lot of the decision-making falls to doctors and physicians and professors and whatever. But the determinants really go way back to childhood. Most important thing, and I'm very glad that the Labour Party is doing this, is to eradicate child poverty. And in the long run, there will be not. If you eradicate child poverty and have children growing up in a nice house, in a nice green environment, they will live a lot longer. They'll have a much better, they will be happier, they'll be thinner, they'll have lower blood pressure, they'll have less diabetes. We know all this. And so it's very important that the Labour Party and similarly minded parties actually grasp that and start back there. I always think of the Labour Party as a party of Samaritans. We're a Samaritan.
One way of looking at us, I suppose.
We are a Samaritan party. When somebody stumbles and falls, one of us is there to lift them up, carry them if necessary. And I think that really should be the way we behave. And if all politicians did that, we'd have a much better, healthier, happier society.
Mm-hmm. Just what we're saying in our policy document, which we're publishing this weekend, is that any strategy on women's health must extend beyond the traditional domain of healthcare and address the social factors which contribute to high rates of ill health among women. Louise, would you say that that's a good focus for us to have?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, the context of Ireland at the moment is one of economic recovery, and it's really important to acknowledge that. But at the same time, despite all of that positivity, 16% of people in Ireland do still live in poverty. And I think it's really important to remember that. I think 1 in 11 people in Ireland experience food poverty. So, poverty hasn't by any stretch of the imagination gone away, and inequality is certainly a very big issue in Ireland. So tackling health on its own, health doesn't happen in a bubble. Health happens in society, and society is about issues of poverty, inequality, and issues around social justice. What kind of society do we want to make? What kind of changes do we want to make to enable issues like health? And to do that, you have to look holistically at the whole society.
Yeah. And Kathleen, just to finish on that, I mean, picking up on Jerry's point about politicians and governments, it is important to remember that there have been incredible advances in our health system. And also, just since it's a Labour Party conference, and we're all Labour Party people, well, no, we're not all, we've guests here as well, and we're delighted to have them, but it's a party conference. We did very important things in government, including in the teeth of the worst recession the country ever saw, and including in the Department of Health, where you and I served together. A little bit of self-praise, but I think it's the party and the government, people like Eamon Gilmore, Joan Burton, Brendan Howlin, actually fighting for the resources that you and I needed in the Department of Health when it was bloody hard to get them.
And I think as a recognition of that, as soon as the last government was formed, a particular organisation, I won't name them, would be unfair, a particular organisation to deal with mental health employed a consultant. And he phoned me to tell me that I just told him, he said, that the reason they won't make as many advances is they haven't got a Kathleen Lynch and they haven't got a Brendan Howlin and they haven't got an Alex White. And that's the reason that you won't make as many advances and things. But in terms of mental health, when we were in government and in the teeth of the worst collapse that this country has seen, we did get additional money for new developments. It wasn't about putting it back into the old system. It was about new developments. A central mental hospital that had been promised for, I think, 70 years, Brendan? 70 years. We managed to get the money for. It is about the under sixes, which is, I think, is the best thing that any government has done in relation to what Jerry has pointed out and our other panellists have pointed out in relation to child poverty. But that was only part of the plan, Alex, as you know. The next part of the plan, and it's there and it's in place, was to bring it to the under-12s and then to the under-18s, which would just leave us then with the report this week that talks about the twilight group, the group just over the threshold but unable to afford it. And there was opposition to that under-6s. There was huge opposition. And they came in and they berated us. You are giving medical cards, she told me, to the higher echelons of the middle classes, I was told. And then I spoke about someone I knew a postwoman, a postman, who had paid out €200 the week before for their sick child. 3 visits to the doctor and medication. Now, that's hardly the higher echelons of the middle classes. But I do think it's important that this morning's focus, I think, even though it has been brought back on several occasions, is about what's to be delivered. I come back again to the fact that a lot of people out there, mainly women, don't understand what is on offer. And even if they get the information, they can't assimilate it to themselves. And we need to start the education as well as offering services. Education is vitally important when it comes to health.
Okay. Kathleen Lynch, Louise Kenny, Louise Caffrey, Jerry Burke, thank you very much. Aoife.
Thank you, Alex. Linda Kelly. Maternity services, as a new mother and cohortist, by the way, I know this is quite close to your heart as a campaigner as well. Can you tell us, if you don't mind, a little bit about your own experience of these services?
Yeah, well, I just had a baby at the end of June, and I would have... She's lovely. And I suppose I went public, which seemed a shock to a lot of people. It never even entered my mind to go for private maternity services. And I have to say the Maternity and Infant Care Scheme is a public service that we as a country can be very proud of. And I think it's really important. Public services get such a bad rap, and we need to be proud of them. But what I will say is that my experience, particularly around the birth, was quite mixed. And it comes back to something which is named in the Labour Party document, which is around male-dominated health services. services. So I was very lucky throughout my pregnancy to be able to access the Domino scheme, which is a midwife-led scheme, which is only available in Dublin, Cork, Waterford and Wexford. Don't ask me why, because I'd probably give you a very cynical answer. But I had difficulties at the birth, and I was there 36 hours after being admitted, and the consultant came along to make a decision about whether we'd go further for an induction or whether we'd go for a caesarean. And he looked at me and he just said, "Sure, we'll give it a go." And that was the level of his medical advice to me in terms of making a choice about the birth of my baby. And I'm not a shy person, I'm not a retiring person, but I was so powerless in that moment to actually advocate for myself. And 4 months later, that feeling is still with me. And it wasn't until 2 days later, a midwife came to me and she explained the medical reasons why it was important for me to labour all through the night before I was then rushed for an emergency C-section. And to me, there is a direct cause and effect between the fact that the upper echelons of obstetrics, gynecology, the Irish Health Service, the Department of Health, and all senior decision makers in this country are men, and the lack of priority that is given to women's health. There is a cause and effect between those two things, and it is radical that that is named in the Labour Party document, because there are plenty of people outside of this room, people watching at home, who will think that that's a red herring, that that's got nothing to do with it, but there are systemic inequalities against women, and to me that is a cause and effect of the fact that it is male dominated at the higher levels. And I think as a party, the fact we've named that in the policy is so radical and something for us to be very proud of.
Linda Kelly, thank you so much. Back over to Alex and our new panel.
Thank you very much, Aoife. So a change of topic now for the next part of this morning's session, or this afternoon's it now is. We're going to talk about housing, the housing crisis, a problem that impacts on tens of thousands of our citizens, people of the country, one that to people sometimes so frustrating for people, I think, that there's almost a sense out in the community that it can't be solved, but of course we know as political people it can be solved, and it was solved in previous generations, including by the actions of this party in governments throughout the period of our existence, going back many, many decades to the foundation of the state, when the governments then and the state proved that it could actually solve such a pressing social and economic and human problem as the right to a roof over your head. So we've got a new panel. Delighted to have some new guests with us. First of all, beside me here is Aideen Hayden, who's the chairperson of Threshold. Jan O'Sullivan, TD, our spokesperson, known to you all. Mike Allen, who's the director of advocacy for Focus Ireland. And down at the end there, Mel Reynolds, architect and very well-known advocate and contributor to this whole debate, intelligent, insightful contributor to this debate in recent years. So we're going to be able to talk to them all, but I'm going to go to Jan first, because Jan, we have produced and published, and you have published earlier this summer, a very comprehensive document on affordable housing for all. I think it's been well received. And congratulations on the document, because it pulls together all of the strands of this difficult issue. And I think it would be fair to say that the concentration is on, as I've said, state-led action to address this question. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. And this document has been produced with the cooperation of a lot of people in this room, because we wanted to produce a comprehensive document. And we also wanted to produce a document that would actually indicate how this issue can be addressed and how it can be solved. Because I think the danger is that people think this is intractable, and it isn't. So first of all, we called it affordable housing for all. So it's very much around social and affordable housing. It's very much about the state leading. And I know Mel has a lot of information around the amount of land that's actually available that is in state hands, either the hands of local authorities or NAMA or other state bodies, and I'm sure he'll give us the statistics later on. But we want to see that that land is used for social and affordable housing. We're very clear on it. We want it to be led by the state in conjunction with local authorities, and our commitment is that over 5 years, using 16 billion euros, where we've identified where the money would come from, we would build 80,000 social and affordable houses. So that's our homes, houses and apartments. That's the core of the policy. But there's also other elements in it, like, for example, and I know Aidan is an expert on this, but the whole area of the rented sector and protection for renters. And I think one of the most disappointing things that we saw in the recent budget was that the focus was on protecting landlords rather than protecting tenants and giving advantage to landlords, and on giving advantage to developers instead of the state leading on the provision of housing. And if I could just refer back to the previous panel, because Jerry Burke made an important point about poverty and about ensuring that children grow up in a decent home, in a decent environment. And that is absolutely key to this. If you look at the fact that there are nearly 4,000 children living in homeless services, that is truly disgraceful. And it is affecting those children's lives. So we want to end that. And that's why we've made very practical proposals, costed and very clearly directed at the state leading, not the private sector. And we think there is an ideological problem with the current government with regard to that, with the Fine Gael party in particular. We are very clear we want the state to lead on this absolutely crucial issue for the Irish people, and it can be done.
Mel, can it be solved?
Absolutely. Absolutely it can be solved. If we can do something badly, we can do it much better. You know, I mean, there's an awful lot of commentary in the media about the housing policy, the housing crisis, etc., and the challenges that are there. The good news is that we have a lot of resources to tackle it. We have a huge amount of land. I think between NAMA controlled debtors and local authorities, there's land there with capacity for about 114,000 dwellings nationwide, and in Dublin it's about 71,000. So the main reason, one of the critical components in any sort of affordable housing scheme or social housing is the availability of development land, and we are awash with it at the moment.
So what needs to happen? What needs to happen quickly in terms of that land and getting access and getting use of that land?
Well, I think the state has to intervene, because the private sector, it's not, the way that the private speculative sector works is it's just not possible to build affordable housing or housing at affordable levels at the moment where it's needed, which is in Dublin. So the state has to get involved, and we know that in the middle of this sort of chaos that we see unfolding in front of us, that there are models out there. I mean, Coolon Housing Alliance, they had a seminar in Dublin this week. They have built, privately funded via AIB on state land, in partnership with Dublin City Council, they built houses for sale to people not on the housing list, to ordinary purchasers, for less than €170,000 in Dublin. So the models are there, and all we need to do is look and see who's doing it correctly, and just roll it out and copy it.
In terms of the parcels of land that are, because I think we drive around, we can see stuff. We can all see with our eyes, and we know. I'm a member of a local authority, and I can see things. I can see sites that are vacant. You ask about them, you get a story about them, and there's always a story and then a backstory. But do you advocate a radical intervention? Would you advocate CPOing? Do you advocate get in there and take the land, take these sites?
Well, no. I mean, I don't think we need to CPO anything. If we just concentrated on what the state actually controls at the moment.
Already in state ownership.
Already. I mean, the state, local authorities currently, there's no need for a land development agency to look at other land. Local authorities in Dublin own enough of zoned residential land for 29,000 dwellings. And in the first 6 months this year, 4 local authorities built 145 houses. That's it. So, you know, if we just concentrate on what we have, local authorities can get a Part A planning permission in about 15 weeks. It takes about 16 weeks to build a typical 3-bed semi-D, a new one. So infrastructure can be done very quickly, and it isn't expensive to put in infrastructure. In Cherrywood, it's around about €1,600 per unit. Okay. So, you know, we have the local authorities in the state control all these variables and can actually get in there and do it very, very quickly. Okay. In terms of the blockage, I'm not quite sure. I think certainly there's no money, and there seems to be a lack of will there in the department to do this.
Okay. I'm going to come to Mike, and I'm going to come to Aidan, but before I do that, I'm going to go across to Aoife Ní Shúilleabháin, who has some guests over there with her.
Thank you, Alex. I'm here with Shane Folan from the Donamead branch. Shane, you have a motion on housing. Would you like to tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. So when I'm on the doors in Donamead and across Dublin's north side, housing really is the one issue that comes up without fail, and it's because people are really scared. You know, it's because for countless people in this country, there's no such thing as a secure home. And we've seen with the Irish Congress of Trades Unions housing charter and their Raise the Roof protests, as well as the Take Back the City protests, there is a huge growing movement of regular people demanding action on it. And the way the government are going on, you'd swear that there is nothing they can do. But that's just simply not the case. You know, as we've heard already, I won't go over it again, but there's so many things that we can do that will fix this in a relatively short space of time. So basically this motion is about showing the government what we can do very quickly and showing support for the other movements out there.
And over to Alex.
Jan, a couple of things in this motion: an assertive vacant site strategy, support for the Take Back the City movement, and calling on the government to make public land available for social and affordable housing that Mel has just been talking about. A quick reaction to the motion, then I'll go to the other.
Yeah, well, I absolutely support the motion. I think, you know, the Take Back the City movement has been directly showing, you know, that there are problems in Dublin in particular with empty buildings while we have a housing crisis. And I think it's important to highlight that. But I think it's also important to have solutions. And I think that motion also refers to the Congress Charter, which I signed up to on behalf of the Labour Party, the Irish Congress Trade Unions, which is a charter, again, around rights to housing. And, you know, I absolutely support what's in that motion. What we need to see now is the action to follow it.
Aideen, on that idea of the charter, and just generally on what's been advocated there, what do you say?
Absolutely. I don't think any of us on this panel would disagree with anything that's been said so far. You know, there is an answer to the housing crisis, but I don't think we should underestimate how severe the housing crisis is. I mean, aside from the 10,000 people who are immediately impacted in terms of being immediately homeless, we have a very significant number of people who are literally 1 month's rent away from being out the door and being homeless. And I don't think we can underestimate the extent of risk we have in our society at the moment. A very short synopsis, a study was done in Ballyfermot that showed that there were 2,000 people in that small area alone who were immediately at risk of losing their homes, either from repossessions or because they were in the private rented sector, or they'd moved back to live with family and they were under severe pressure. So we have that second tier group as well. And on top of that then we have renters. I mean, up until June of this year, our National Tenancy Protection Service in Threshold dealt with 7,000 people who were at immediate risk of losing their homes. Half of them were working. So the whole idea that we have of who becomes homeless, what the risks are out there, you know, that is completely shattered today in comparison to what it was maybe 10 or 15 years ago. But there are solutions. I mean, there's no question or doubt about that. And I think, you know, the saying, never waste a crisis, is really critical in this point, in this situation. There are some great proposals out there about, for example, how we use state lands. But we also need to see the state taking a more direct intervention in the market. I think one of the problems we have had in Ireland is a boom-bust cycle. We've gone through this before. We went through it in the early 90s, went through it in the 80s. You know, we actually need to get back to the drawing board here. I mean, Jan is completely right. I mean, I personally think that 30% of all housing in this country should be publicly owned in one size, shape or form. And that is about the amount of housing that we absolutely have to have in public ownership to stop this boom-bust cycle. And those steps need to be taken, and now. And I do agree there are some very quick answers and quick solutions, but I do also feel that the fundamental model of our social housing, how we fund it, how we allocate it, the way we approach things like mixed tenure development and so on, is really critical. And we can have a much better society and a much better housing system going forward if we tackle it now.
Mike, just like Aideen, you are witnessing the impact of this crisis on a daily, nightly basis in your organisation. So what do you say are the headline critical priorities that need to be addressed?
Yeah, I think the Irish Congress of Trade Unions intervention in this is extremely important, and Focus Ireland has very much welcomed that, because Focus Ireland has always seen homelessness as an outcome of poor or bad housing policy. It's not because something is wrong with somebody that they're homeless, it's because of something that's wrong with our system. When you're in a crisis, we simply don't have enough homes for the number of people who need a home. And that means it's a distributional issue, which is an issue which the Labour Party frequently looks at in terms of poverty and so on, often doesn't look at housing in that sort of way. And people who are more vulnerable are the ones who are being pushed to the edges as people try and fight for their own situation within the housing market. So the intervention of trade union movement and other broad social movements to recognise that the interests of people who are homeless and the interests of people who are vulnerable to homelessness and the interests of ordinary workers who are facing escalating rents are the same. One of the big fears would be that different aspects of society would end up fighting against each other for a hold in the housing market, and I think that's important. I think from our point of view then, I mean, we're absolutely supporting everything that Mel is saying and other people have said about the important role that public sector, the local authorities and so on need to do in solving the homeless crisis. To some extent, people characterise that as an ideological argument, and it can be an ideological position if you want it to be. But from Focus Ireland's point of view, it's an entirely pragmatic point of view. If you were in government and you need to solve this problem, you need to look at the instruments that are available to you as a government and not the instruments that are available to the private sector. And government needs to do what government needs to do. That's why we created an independent state, so that we could achieve things. And this is a hugely important one. The final point I want to make at this point is that to us it's enormously important how people who are experiencing homelessness are treated. And at the moment, there is no framework for doing that. We're still using legislation which doesn't recognise that homelessness happens to families and happens to children. The whole work that went into introducing children's rights and children's first legislation is completely absent from the way in which homeless services and health services and so on react to homeless families and the 4,000 children that Jan mentioned. And we need to get the big problem right, but in the meantime we have to make sure that we do not destroy the lives of a whole generation of people.
Could I just add to that? I published a homeless families bill, which was passed by the Dáil and has now gone to committee, and I was actually invited to the Housing Committee to present it recently. And that is precisely the point that Mike has just made, that in the current situation, children are treated as dependents of adults. They're not treated in their own right when they become homeless. So that's why they end up in Garda stations, etc. So I think it's really important that we get this bill through to deal with precisely the point that Mike has just raised.
There's a lot to reflect on there, but before we do that, back to Aoife to hear from some more of our members and colleagues.
Thank you, Alex. And I'm just going to let Shane come in very quickly as a response.
Yeah, I think it was really clear after that discussion and from the motion itself that we can't wait for the government to act. We really need to take the lead on this ourselves, not just as Labour Party members, but everyone in here, but everyone watching at home, support all the movements that are doing that and really make the government action this.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Shane. Now I have Councillor Fiona Bonfield with me here. Fiona, can you tell us a little bit about your motion?
Yeah, I suppose we're backing Jan's motion there for the building of 80,000 social homes. I suppose as a councillor in Tipperary, when I came onto this council back around 2014, we had over 3,500 people on a housing list. And the current status with that list at the moment in Tipperary is that it actually has increased. So really it goes to show what is there at the moment is not working. And I suppose housing is a basic social need. Every citizen of this country deserves a proper roof over their head. And I suppose that's why we're backing Jan's proposal that we need to build these homes. It needs to be state-led and it needs to be done now.
Thank you very much, Fiona. And I have Luke Field. Luke, you're looking for a referendum. Tell us about your motion.
Well, we've had some success with those recently, so probably a bit of inspiration there. So the purpose of the referendum that I'm proposing through this motion would be to insert the right to a home into the Constitution. Because at the moment, if you read Bunnock Naharan, if you read the 1937 Constitution, if you read Article 43, which is the piece that deals with private property, the strength of the rights in and around private property, very, very strong. Very little by comparison the way of mentioning someone's right to a secure home, somewhere where they can live, somewhere they can build their lives. And the consequence of that, I believe, underpins a lot of what was discussed today already. As Jan has mentioned, there's a narrative that this is an economic problem rather than a political or an ideological problem. It is absolutely a political problem. It is absolutely an ideological problem. It is no coincidence that a document designed by very conservative people in 1937 that has been the foundation of the policy on housing that has been implemented by all of the Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael-led governments, which have been all of our governments since that constitution was passed. They strengthen the rights of private property holders. They do not empower ordinary people to secure their homes, whether that be in the form of private renting from the state, etc. And the problem with that is if we want to turn to a state activist model of dealing with the housing crisis, which I think is the right thing to do, it's certainly the way Labour is proposing, and I agree with it, we also need to look at the ideological problems inherent within the state, and that's certainly one of them. Now, if you look at Cork, and of course as a Corkman, I'm always going to prioritise Cork, no surprise there, the rise in renting and particularly the average rent in the city area has increased 12.5% since this time last year. In the county areas, it's gone up by 10.8% because people are being pushed out of the city areas into the rural areas because they can't afford the rents in the city. Now, there's massively ballooning rents in the county areas as well. If you've been pushed out of the city into the county and you're about to be pushed out of the county because the rent is getting too high there too, where do you go? And having a change in the constitution that empowers the state to act immediately to secure people's right to a home, and that makes it a much greater priority than the right of a small number of people to make a profit from their security of private property. That really empowers us to make an immediate change and a lasting change, something that goes beyond sort of short-term proposals into a much longer-term shift in the emphasis of state policy and what this state prioritises for its citizens.
I suppose we very much see it as well. We can see in the cities a big impact on actually third-level students when they're hoping to study in a particular college and they can't find accommodation. Is there anything we can do to ensure some protection for them?
Well, you know, if you're starting from the position of a secure home, however you want to interpret that is important. And, you know, it's certainly impacting people's ability to study now. You're seeing a lot of very, in my opinion, predatory private interest groups setting up private student accommodation at incredibly expensive rates. And if you have an empowered state body with an empowered state education system, you can also have an empowered state education housing system producing proper state housing at an affordable rate for those students who want to attend third-level institutions. And at the moment now, you have this horrific situation, and I've been a renter for 10 years, so I know exactly how this feels. You're struggling to get accommodation when you're attending college, and then when you graduate, you're struggling to find accommodation near where you're going to work if you've been lucky enough to find a job. And we need to correct that cycle, we need to stop it, and we need to empower the state to deliver housing for all of people's lives, because the trauma that's created of an unsecure home, whether that be when you're studying, whether that be when you're a child, whether that be as an adult or an elder, whatever the case may be, that can be incredibly long-lasting. That can last for your entire life, this feeling of an unsecure home. And if we deal with that as early as possible, the changes will be lifelong for everybody involved.
Luke Field, thank you very much. And Alex, back over to you.
I'm going to go quickly, first of all, to Jan, just on two motions, because remember, this is a party conference, and these are party members bringing forward their motions. Two there, one from the Newport branch in Tipperary, saying 80,000 social houses over the next 5 years, which is what you've been saying yourself. And then the second one there, Cork South Central Constituency Council, calling for a referendum and talking about the rights of private property. What do you say?
And just to respond to the issue in student housing, we want student housing to be included in the rights, because the rent pressure zones, for example, don't include student housing, which we believe it should be included. So just to make that point, absolutely support the right to a home being put to the people by way of constitutional amendment. Over 80 countries have either a statutory or a constitutional right to a home. And what it would do would redress the balance with private property. The rights of private property in the Constitution are very strong. And if you put the right to a home in there, then you get a much better balance. And I think that would fundamentally change the way in which the state has to approach housing. And I suppose, to take up Mike's point, whatever the ideology of the political party in government, and obviously we want our ideology, if you change the Constitution, then that has to be the basis for how you go about providing housing for all our people. And on Fiona's motion, absolutely support it. But can I say about Labour councillors around the country, Labour councillors have stood up for social housing in a way that other councillors have spoken in one way in the Dáil, and then they go back to their patch and they fight against social housing in their own area. That is wrong. But certainly my experience of Labour councillors around the country, and indeed Elena's up there, and she is in my own constituency, who is an example of it, our Labour councillors have voted for social housing when others have shamelessly stood up in the Dáil, their party, and I'll name Fianna Fáil as one of them, and then at local level have opposed social housing. So absolutely support the motions.
Mel, coming back to the state lands, and when we talk about the state, of course, there are a lot of different state bodies. So there's state agencies, local authorities. The HSE, for example, owns a lot of land. I'm not saying that they've any that's particularly free. The priorities as well, but they need to be put on the list. The transport companies, all of these agencies are in fact agencies of the state. So I think, would you extend your account of it right across the board to all of those bodies?
Well, absolutely. I think as a medium or longer term exercise you would do that, and you'd look at the management of land. I think the issue that we have at the moment is, as Mike has said before, you have to keep the patient alive at the moment. So really the whole sector has moved to a far more acute stage, and we need to look at really, really immediate solutions to the sort of issues that the other panellists have alluded to here. As a measure of, ironically it's used as a measure of success of the current government policy, but housing assistance payment is actually a measure of how many households are experiencing rental distress for the first time. And last year there was 17,900 new HAP tenancies created, which is 50 per day. So, you know, and on the one hand, an 80,000 over 5 years may seem like a huge number. That's 16,000 a year, which is probably where we need to be in terms of social and affordable housing at the moment. I think last year there was 56 affordable houses built, and the official scheme was stood down in 2011. So we're really at a far more acute stage now at the moment, and I think in the middle of all this, it looks as if the private sector supply is starting to slow down, so we may see a levelling off or dropping in new home supply coming out of the private sector. But there are other pressures on the rental sector coming down the tracks, which are the arrears. We have a huge amount of arrears properties, in particular investment properties, which have now been taken over by funds, private equity funds. And you will start to see an awful lot of people entering into basically being told to leave their property when it's coming up for sale in the next 6 to 8 months. And that's a real short-term problem that we have at the moment. And this probably factors into later motions that you're going to talk about here about security of tenure, trying to keep people in their properties. The issue with tenanted properties is that you either sell them or receivers appointed. The repossession process doesn't kick in at all. So this is a real issue, and we've got there's only about 1,200 available rentals in Dublin at the moment. So it doesn't take an awful lot. You don't need a tsunami to create serious distress there. You just need a little increase in the amount of vacant properties that we have, and it's a big problem.
Aideen, or Mike, I'll come to Mike in a minute. What do you say on this idea of a constitutional right? I mean, is that something, obviously it's laudable on the face of it, it makes sense. Is it the answer though, or is it part of the answer?
I definitely think it's part of the answer. I think too often we use the Irish Constitution as a shield and not a sword. And I think there have been many instances where legislation has been proposed that may have ultimately been enacted, but was very much slowed down by this whole, you know, we have to consult the Attorney General as to whether it's constitutional, etc., etc., etc. One of those instances was Labour's rent freeze in 2015, for example. So I absolutely, totally believe that we should push on as quickly as we possibly can with putting a right to a home in the Constitution. And I was very fortunate to have been part of the Constitutional Convention, and I fought very hard then to have that put. And I suppose I'm somewhat disappointed, and I'm not suggesting blasphemy is not an important issue, but I personally would have preferred to have been out voting on a right to a home in our Constitution, along with our electoral Michael Higgins.
I suppose, Mike, I would just put this question, not to argue necessarily with it, but just to, I suppose, foster a bit of debate. Sometimes we tend in this country to say, and of course most of the referendums we've had, all of them have been necessary and we've all fought for them, but sometimes is there not an inclination where we say, let's put it in the Constitution, and we have a sense, perhaps a naive sense, that if it's in the Constitution that will solve it, whereas of course we still actually have to build the houses, we still have to get the land, we still have to fund it, we still have to do all the distributional things that Mel and you guys have been talking about. So in that context, a constitutional amendment, what do you say?
Well, Focus Ireland has supported a right to housing in the Constitution for over 20 years, and Focus Ireland spoke at the Constitutional Convention that Aideen just mentioned, arguing for that, and the Constitution voted for it in the context of... so let's not forget that, and it is probably the most significant proposal that was supported by the Convention process, which hasn't been acted on, and that's... But the problem with the constitutional referendum is you have to make a case that it's going to change the world, to mobilise people around it. And it's not going to be the one thing that makes the difference. This problem of housing crisis, homeless crisis, is solvable, but it's not going to be solvable easily or with one measure. But I think what's emerged over the last couple of years is that the absence of such a right is a problem. So it's clear in terms of, as you mentioned, the rent controls, but for instance, what's been called the Focus Island Amendment, which is the amendment which would remove the loophole in which landlords can essentially tear up a tenancy agreement if they want to sell the property. And that's the major cause, the single largest cause of families becoming homeless in Dublin. That's been blocked because it's apparently somebody says it's against the Constitution. So essentially what seems to happen is that the Attorney-General seems to take a view that if an arguable case can be made by somebody that it's against the Constitution, it never gets any further. So the existence of the right to property in the Constitution and in the absence of a right to housing is a genuine problem, a barrier to the things we need to do. So it's not that it's going to solve the problem in itself. It will create a context in which a government with a genuine commitment to solving it wouldn't be held up by
Let me go back to Aoife and see what your people think of some of those responses.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Luke Field, how do you feel about those comments?
I'd like to thank the panel very much for a very warm, positive response. I certainly think the referendum, when passed, will give a lot of power and weight to all of the proposals we've heard, both short and long term. I'd like to thank everybody for mentioning ideology so upfrontly, which is something that we're not always great at doing in this country, whether that's about us wanting our socialist ideology in government, but also taking this opportunity to mobilise people in a referendum to push out the conservative ideology of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael from that part of our constitution, and to just really secure this long-term ability of the state to intervene and give people a home when they need it, and to make sure they're secure in that home. I'm delighted with the support we're seeing for this.
Thank you, Luke. And we are here with Alina Sikas. Alina, your motion on publicly owned land is very relevant to this discussion. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, the motion is about ensuring that publicly owned land will not be sold off and that local authorities will acquire land banks to enable them to address their needs for social and affordable housing. We are in a critical housing crisis, which is getting worse day after day. It is not getting better. And the housing policy has failed because the government keeps looking to the private sector for solutions. And this is simply not working. The solution is to supply good quality social and affordable homes for everyone in this country who needs a home and when they need a home. And that can be achieved only through state-led action. The public land should be used in public interest, given the fact that it was acquired with public funding. And it should be used for state-led social and affordable housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Lena. And back over to Alex.
Jan, I'm only going to assume that you'll agree that this is a valid motion or a good motion because it comes from Limerick City Constituency Council.
Yes.
But I'm sure you agree with it anyway.
I do indeed.
Do you?
And I suppose maybe at this point, if I could say a little bit about affordable housing, because I think people often have a bit of confusion about what affordable housing is. And sometimes it's defined by more conservative parties, including in Britain, as a percentage reduction on the market rate. We would like to see it much more related to income, and we want real affordability. And there are a number of models. The O'Coolan model, obviously, is one model of affordable housing, where houses can be bought at affordable prices. And generally, the income levels, I think, they are up to about 75,000 per annum per couple, 50,000 for an individual. So we're talking about the very, very large percentage of people in our communities who are actually working, and who can't afford a deposit, can't afford to buy, can't afford the rents, and are stuck in the middle. So I think affordable housing is very important alongside social housing. And when the government talks about mixed tenure, and that's their excuse for giving up 60% of the land for private developers, of course you do get that mixed tenure if you have affordable, and if you have those kind of levels of middle income included in the affordable possibilities. So things like rent, I think we have a motion actually coming on later on cost rental. But another model which we have suggested is one that was piloted in Dublin a few years ago, which is rent to buy, whereby you rent for 3 years, you pay your rent, and then the rent becomes the deposit to buy the home. And I think there were 3 pilot models of that in Dublin that were very successful. I think that's a way as well that you can allow people who currently can't save for a deposit because their rents are so high, and actually get them into that affordable purchase. So, you know, there are a number of models on affordability, but I think it's important that we actually define what we mean by affordable housing and how it goes side by side with social housing.
And that can be a difficult one for people to get their heads around, because we did have all these ideas. There was social and affordable, and then there's affordable, and why would there ever be anything that wasn't affordable, people ask. So it just becomes hard conceptually for people to get their heads around what that actually means. I don't know if you have a view on that, Mel, but I would think about that if you'd like to comment on it. But also, this motion, this Limerick motion, is saying, look, you've got lands, you own lands, the local authorities have these assets. Don't, for God's sake, be selling any of them.
Well, I agree totally with that. I think NESC did a very good report at the start of the summer, which looked at the whole area of state-owned land, and their very strong recommendation was not to sell this into the private sector. The reason for that is when you enter into, say, for example, a PPP arrangement or sell land into the private sector, you lose control. So you lose the ability to control what gets developed on the site, you lose the ability to control what the sales price is. And really, you're releasing the birds out into the wild and say, okay, a developer is going to look for the best return and the best site value he can get, or he or she can get, in the use. And currently, for example, in Dublin City, you wouldn't entertain residential as a use between the canals, because it's probably one of the least profitable uses you could put a site to. You look at student housing, hotel or hostel accommodation. They are the main ones. So, you know, currently the private sector is targeting the upper 20% of earners, and we know that, you know, we're building at very, very low volumes. There's about 9,600 houses completed in County Dublin in 2.5 years, and 7,400 sales. So, you know, there's very low transaction levels, and we know that, say, for example, the median first-time buyer's price is about €370,000, which is way over where it should be. And going back to Jan's definition of an affordable housing being a percentage of income, we should be looking at less than 240,000 as a sales price, based on an average income between 1.5 people working, or a couple working, one person part-time, one person full-time. Their salary would be about €64,000, 240 is the max, and about 180 is the max for a single-person household. In terms of rents, it should be around 1,400 for family, and about 850 for a single person. So in Dublin City at the moment, in Church Street, student housing is being built, going back to the earlier comment, and it's being rented for $11.50 a month per bedroom. So the market is currently providing student housing, which is not affordable for a single person on an average salary. So we really, the private sector isn't addressing this market, which is the affordable, the no man's land really between 35 and 70,000 euros. And the state really has to do it. There's no other alternative than to do that, because the private sector can't do it. It's not possible to do it at the moment.
And is it, well, that's just the two on that point, that they can't do it or it's not possible. And then we have the debate about ideology and the private sector and leaving it to the private sector. Again, maybe just to play devil's advocate for a minute. Is it ideology, or is it actually that from the point of view of a private developer, it just doesn't make economic sense? In terms of the way the parameters are at the moment for profits.
I'm not.
I'm only asking the question.
I'm not. The ideology is other people's part of it. But if you look at it for example, in 2017, the Society of Chartered Surveyors looked at the cost of a typical house. Sorry, 2016, and they worked out with a site value of €50,000. The sales price, when you add in all your normal bits and pieces of site levies, architects, engineers' fees, VAT, etc., the sales price was $330,000. Now that's 2 years ago, and that's already way over. $240. So we know that costs are going up by about 7% a year, so that's, you could add another, it's probably about $360 now. But even if you look at the market value of Dublin City Council, for example, their sites, they have 21 sites on the vacant site register, and the average site value there by Dublin City Council is $68,000 per unit. So even if Dublin City Council was to build out, hand those sites over to a developer today, you'd be looking at prices of around $380. So it's not possible for the state at market value to deliver affordable housing at 240 or below it. There has to be a subsidy there, and that value, that sort of the land value is critical to that. So there are low margin entities like O'Coulon or other co-ops who are trying to get off the ground, but it's the land, critically the land value is a big part of this. And if the state starts looking at capturing land value, or these are the type of phrases coming out of the LDA that we hear, the Land Development Agency, we have a big problem on our hands, because even if at face value we're way out there at the moment.
That's a great explanation, can I just say, really clear, and thank you. Aoife, back to you.
Councillor Neil McNeilish, Neil O'Hara, your motion refers to protection for tenants, and as Luke was saying there earlier, this crisis is nationwide, but we are seeing that some of the cities are the hardest hit. How important is something like this for Galway?
Well, in Galway last night, we probably had about 150 children stayed in hotels in the city centre. We now book emergency accommodation about 6 months in advance. I was talking to all the other councillors from around the country earlier on, and it's a big issue in absolutely every single town out there at the moment. And it's the main issue that all of us as Labour councillors are dealing with on an ongoing basis. But if it wasn't for the likes of Aideen and Threshold, we'd have an even bigger crisis, because at least we can get them and explain what their rights are at the moment. But there's landlords out there that are just really being the bully boys, turning around, using excuses that, you know, the son is coming home from America, or that, you know, they have to sell up or whatever like that. And the next thing, 2 weeks later, the house is turned into an Airbnb. So you've the likes of Kevin Humphreys, who's actually worked really hard in this at the moment to actually get on top of that. But like, what we need to do is make sure, first of all, that the legislation that needs to be put in place to actually protect tenants has to be put in place. And Threshold have been calling for these loopholes to be fixed for a long time, and we just have to make sure that we actually work on that and make sure the tenants know exactly what their rights are, because they're just being abused all the time.
Thank you very much, Neil. And I'm going to come to Elaine Dooley. Elaine, Jan mentioned earlier a cost rental scheme. Can you tell us a little bit more about your motion?
Yeah, well, it's about cost rental, and really it's about affordable rental scheme for people, because rents are spiralling, and unfortunately wages are not spiralling along with it. So people are struggling. They're struggling in the middle. They're working. They're not entitled to social housing supports. They're not entitled to HAP, and so they're trying to save, but the rent is just spiralling out of all their reach. And it's just becoming more and more difficult. And as the longer it takes them, I suppose, to work up a deposit and save for a deposit, the higher the prices of the houses are actually going up, you know. So it is becoming more and more difficult for people in the middle to be able to afford to rent for a start, which I suppose a generation ago, rent used to be a step up. It used to be a stepping stone to buying a house, but now it's just crazy. People are getting stuck in the middle. So really, it's just about, I suppose, getting an affordable rental scheme for people so that they can get a dig out, I suppose, give them a hand.
And can you explain to us a little bit how a scheme like this might work?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's, you know, rental prices are spiralling, and the market is not really a solution for everybody. So this idea is that the rent would be maybe a lot less than the market and what people can afford at the moment. So that's the idea behind it. And I suppose that the idea is that then once, you know, the loans are paid off, that they would then go on and there'd be more affordable rental then for more people that need it.
Elaine, thank you very much. And Alex, back over to you.
Thanks, Aoife. Just to keep us right, I'll go to the spokesperson first, just for a quick reaction to those two motions, one from Galway West and the other from Little Place branch in Dublin West.
Yes, I'm fully supportive of both motions. I think in particular the Galway West motion, I've already referred to the cost rental issue, but the Galway West motion is really important, and Aideen again obviously has a huge amount of knowledge on that. We drafted a bill some time ago, a comprehensive bill, around the whole issue of renting and issues around security of tenure, fair rent, which we know from the old Land League days were important to people in Ireland, are very, very important to people in Ireland now. And a series of measures around controlling increase in rent, around ensuring that people can stay in their homes, and that this issue that Mike referred to around people being kicked out because the property is being sold, addressing all of those issues in a comprehensive way. That's really what we need. We need security. And can I also shout out to Kevin Humphreys on the great work he's done on Airbnb and short-term lettings. Because he's actually managed to get the government to respond, so well done, Kevin.
Aideen Hayden, you're the chairperson of Threshold. you've seen these motions or heard them being advocated there. What do you say? This is on the rental sector, really is your area.
Well, I suppose, first of all, I'd like to say to Neil, thank you very much. And Neil, as you well know, like 1 in 3 families in Galway rent. But we don't respect renters in the way that we respect homeowners in Ireland. I don't know if it's to do with our history, whether it's to do with landlord and tenant relations or whatever the hell it is, but the bottom line of it is we do not think of a rented home as being a real home. And the fact of the matter is real families live in those homes. They go to real schools, they attend real GAA teams, they really want their kids to be living in the same house in a year's time or 2 years' time or 3 or whatever it is. But our rental system does not support that. There's no two ways about it. It is incredibly insecure. Just going back to the whole issue of the rent pressure zones, they're not working. Rents in this country are 30% higher now than they were at the height of the last boom. We see in, say, Dublin, for example, rents rose, and this is a very conservative estimate, over 10% last year. Now, clearly, rent pressure zones at 4%, they are not working. So, I mean, I know that it's part of Labour Party policy to extend the rent pressure zones nationally, but I've actually come to the conclusion that we should really be looking at a complete rent freeze at the moment, because the whole system is far less controlled. And if I just might say, in terms of the whole issue of landlords selling up and all of that, that is the biggest cause of homelessness today in Ireland, is landlords selling up. Now, some of them are genuinely selling up. They've been reluctant landlords for years, and now the property's back in positive equity and they want to get out. And that is a real issue. We face a crisis of seismic proportions in the rental sector, and I do not underestimate that. We've seen a real change in Ireland. Our rate of home ownership, and this goes to the motion on cost rental and affordable housing and so forth, we've seen the level of home ownership in this country fall by over 10% in a very short space of time. We have what's been called, this is not to Ireland alone, it's happening internationally. We have what's called generation rent. We did a survey recently where 1 in 4 people that we interviewed, and this is nationally in our entire service, never expect to own their own homes. Now, that is a real seismic shift for Ireland. It's a real seismic shift for us as a country. It's a real seismic shift for the kind of salaries people are going to have to earn in the future. It's a real seismic shift for what are we going to do when people are older and rents are going up and up and up. We have a rental sector that we are not properly regulating, we're not properly controlling it, and we're acting to renters like they don't really matter.
Mike, what will you add to that from your experience and from what you're observing?
Yeah, I think in terms of understanding the nature of the crisis that we're facing, I think the discussion is right to place the underlying problem in that is the failure to build sufficient amount of social housing and move social housing from being a tenure which ordinary working people lived in and lived in perfectly happily to a tenure which is essentially problematic. It used to be good news. I don't want to be over-romanticized about the past, but it used to be good news in communities when the local council was announcing they were going to build more social housing. Now it isn't considered as good news, and every announcement of social housing, and Jan referred to this, is immediately responded to by local residents' organisations resisting it. We need to it's good to hear that Labour councils will be supporting social housing, but you need to make a very strong case to explain to people why social housing is positive, and you need to change the way that local authorities manage it so that we deliver on that promise. So it's hugely important that we get rid of, what do you call it, an ideology or a mislearning about the past, which people think that you can't build social housing because it always leads to a disaster. That's not true. But so while the underlying problem is in the failure to build social housing, it's being played out in the private sector, private rented market. That's where the problems are actually being experienced, because people who should have been securely housed at affordable rents have been forced to live in the private sector, private rented sector, and that's overcrowded and people being forced out. So the range of different things we need to be able to do at the same time is quite complex. We need to be able to respond to it, and it's there's a failure to address an all-government approach to homelessness. I mean, I heard the debate about, you made the point yourself, Alex, about women's health isn't just about the health service. In the same way, solving the homeless problem isn't just about local authorities, it's about a whole range of different issues, from the banking sector through to the building sector, to the taxation and the health sector as well. And under the last government, there was a cabinet subcommittee which looked at those issues on a regular basis. That seems to have disappeared completely off the agenda, and now it's the Department of Housing
And in fact, in the
that's
government,
not going to solve the problem.
there was a subcommittee, but I remember actually one of the points that Alan Kelly used to make, and it stuck with me, was that when he was bringing forward initiatives in the Department of the Environment, it was to try to get deeper and try to get finance across these initiatives that you really can't. Like, there's no way the most radical, the most progressive policy just in the Custom House is going to succeed unless it also has Marion Street across it as well. Isn't that the, that's the point? Okay, Aoife, I think you have two more.
Mr. Mark Wall, it's very evident we're experiencing a housing crisis in this country, and you say it's time to declare a national emergency.
There's absolutely no doubt about that, Aoife. We need the Fine Gael government and indeed the Fianna Fáil supporters that they have at the moment to declare a national housing emergency. I suppose notwithstanding the very positive cross-party vote that was in the Dáil a couple of weeks ago, but unfortunately that's going to be ignored. Like last night here at conference, we learned about 100,000 people on council waiting lists. We've 10,000 people in homeless. And the big disaster, of course, for everybody involved, and the big tragedy for our country at the moment is almost 4,000 children in homeless, living in hotels, and that is an absolute tragedy for this country at the moment. And I suppose another important point is those that are actually getting out of bed. As our Taoiseach says about people getting out of bed, there are people getting out of bed going to work and they cannot afford a home at the moment. We heard about this Rebuilding Ireland loan coming out in last February, and in the area that I represent, the Athy Municipal District, we've had only one successful loan since last February, which is totally and utterly unacceptable. I deal with some great people in the housing section of Kildare County Council. I deal with them on a daily basis, but they're under so much pressure. There's absolutely no doubt about that. They're getting calls, they're getting presentations from desperate people and from their loved ones every day of the week. We need to support them. I've heard all the arguments today in relation to public land. Why are we giving away public land? Why is this the ideology of Fine Gael? It is totally unacceptable. What was wrong with building council houses? Mel has said it here, there's council land in every little village in South Kildare where I represent. The council are willing to do it, but as has been said by Alex in the last, it's the department that seems to be reluctant to give the funding for it. 4 stages to try and get a house built, totally and utterly unacceptable. Look, we have heard the arguments here for a housing emergency. I hope the conference, the Labour Party have always stood up for housing. I'm sure conference will do that once again, so I'm looking forward to hear what the panel are going to say.
Okay, thank you, Mark. And Councillor Mary McCarnley, in the era of Airbnb, there's a real concern of available accommodation to rent. What can we do to ensure that there's more long-term renting available?
Just before I answer that, I'm going to make Senator Humphrey's ears red now because I'm going to mention him on the 3rd time in 5 minutes. So I'd just like to commend him on the work that he's been doing on the Airbnb over the last few years, and he's been working extremely hard to lobby the government to do something. At last, the government is listening to his common sense and they are doing something, but when are they doing it? They're doing it in June 2019. Do they not realise there's an emergency on, that people need houses? We in Ireland today, in the 21st century, we have tourists living in our houses and children living in hotels. It is just unbelievable. It's crazy stuff. Crazy stuff. So what we need to do now is to bring what the government is doing forward to try and get people out of the Airbnb system, put it back into long-term renting, put our people back into houses. The thing about Airbnb is it doesn't create communities. There's no sense of community. You could be living in an apartment, come out on a daily basis, and somebody new is living in the next door. You don't know who it is. There's different people coming in every day, every month. And as well as that, even down the country in our tourist towns, they are now taking over. Airbnb are taking over. There are people, native people, not living in the towns now. They're all tourists living in the towns during the summer. So it's killing communities. Do you know? It is killing communities. So we need to try and get back and do some sort of lobbying to the government to bring this forward, to get something done so that we can take over these houses. These are houses that can be rented long term. These are houses that can be used for HAP. These are houses that people can buy. Elaine was just talking about affordable housing. There are young people out there who cannot afford to buy a house simply because there isn't enough houses going. Now, if there's not enough houses going, how many houses are there in the Airbnb at the moment? Thousands in the city. We need to take them back and we need them for renting.
Thank you very much, Mary. And back over to you, Alex.
Right. Jan, speaks for itself, really, doesn't it? Those
Absolutely,
two
absolutely.
motions. But you have two motions there, one from Kildare South and one from Mulhuddard.
Well,
what do you
fully
say?
support Mulhuddard in everything that's been said, and we'll mention Kevin for the 4th time because he deserves it.
This will have to stop.
So I'm
we're going to have to give a list of everybody now in a minute.
No, I'm going to respond to Mark's motion around an emergency, declaring an emergency. Now, unfortunately, I don't think one should have to declare an emergency if the government was doing what it should be doing, but it isn't. And therefore, I support the motion of declaring an emergency, because we have an absolute jewel in our hands as a state in terms of the amount of land, and Mel has indicated there, could build 114,000 homes around the country. It's an absolute jewel. It's in state hands. It can be used for what is required, which is homes for our people. And yet, 2 years into rebuilding Ireland, what are we being faced with? We're being faced with 60% of the land in the large development lands that are there in state ownership, actually being offered for profit, private profit. And that is absolutely against the ideology of the Labour Party, and it is obviously the ideology of government. And I'm sorry for going back to ideology, but it's about ideology.
And even if it doesn't accord, even if it's an ideological point, Mel, and we're not going to get you to bring you back into trespass and ideology, but it doesn't make sense either, does it?
It doesn't make any sense at all. And I mean, one of the interesting things that when everyone leaves here today, just have a look around and look at the amount of vacant space that you pass by on the way when you go home. Over shops, you were talking about Cork earlier. UCC did a study about a year and a half ago, the North King Street study, and they looked at City Centre Street in Cork City, and by rebuilding, using 5 vacant sites in that street and occupying or converting upper floors, they could increase the capacity of dwellers on that street by 280%. Dublin City Council have done another study, a desktop study, looking at vacant space in existing buildings over shops in between the canals. And there's enough space, without building any new houses at the moment, for 4,000 apartments in Dublin City. So that you can actually decant almost all the Airbnb properties into vacant upper floors at the moment, if we were smart about it. So we could actually bring in some sort of incentive to, bring the short term. Let's use that demand that's there, instead of trying to curb it and letting it being uncontrolled at the moment. You could actually use that demand to re-inhabit our cities and our towns.
We're coming to sorry to interrupt, but we're coming to an end. Do you want to take 30 seconds to give us your top line, each of the, certainly 3, maybe Jan as well, just to give us your 30-second prescription of what absolutely needs to happen in the period ahead? Okay, number 1, every state-owned site must have 100% social and affordable housing. Number 2... Give us the applause after them all. Go ahead.
Number 2 is affordability has to be defined by income in terms of rental and by rental and purchase. And number 3 is we need to have security of tenure. Absolutely essential.
Thank you, Mel. Mike?
Well, I can cheat by taking all of his, which I think... There's one I'd slightly disagree with from what Mel said, is he talked about incentives to deal with the empty property. We need to also start penalising people who are holding on to property that we need in this crisis for no good reason. There's an overuse of carrots. I think landlords in this country are likely to die over an overdose of carrots if we go on in the way we're going. But from our point of view, we need a homeless strategy which focuses on the family homelessness crisis. We need a children first policy to that. We need a commitment that no family will be in homeless accommodation for more than 6 months.
Adrian.
First of all, I think we need to stem the tide into homelessness, and it is possible to do that with supports. That's point number 1. Secondly, obviously security of tenure. As I said, I think we really need to look at a rent freeze. Thirdly, and this is a point I want to make in relation to something Mel said, I am very concerned at the number of institutional investors that have come into the private rented market. 1/3 of all commercial transactions, not just residential, but commercial, full stop, 1/3 of them were either private renting or they were student accommodation. Now, they're not renting to the bottom end of the market. They're renting to people where the rents start at 1,250. Sure. And I think they're being tax incentivised, they're being supported by government, and we need to change that.
Jan, I'm going to give you 15 seconds.
Well, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said by the panel.
That's
and what we need to do is build social and affordable houses and homes on the land that the state owns. I think that's the most important thing, and in the meantime, protect those who are stuck in the private rental
we want to give our members the last word. Aoife.
Absolutely, Jan is 100% right. We shouldn't have to declare an emergency, but unfortunately, my God, there's no option but to declare an emergency. Let's do it. Let's get behind it. It will happen. I'm sure the Labour Party will do that. We need social, we need affordable houses, but we need them now, Aoife.
Thank you, Mark. And Councillor Mary Hamley, I'm just going to come to you again.
Just to get the government, to lobby the government to bring that scheme forward so that something can be done about Airbnb.
Okay, thank you. Alex?
Thank you, Aoife, and thank you very much to everybody on your side of the stage and on my side of the stage who've contributed to this debate, both this one on housing, Mel Reynolds, Mike Allen, John O'Sullivan, Aideen Hayden. Thank you especially. And can we've had a number of name checks of our colleagues, but can I just name check Jan O'Sullivan, even though she's sitting right here in front of us? Having worked in government with Jan, having seen the work that she's done since we were again in opposition, right across so many different areas of policy, this especially, but also on the 8th Amendment, on so many different issues of importance to the party and to the country. She's been an absolutely stellar representative of the party and of the people of Limerick. And in case that sounded like past tense, I have no doubt will continue to be so in the future.
Bring it on.
Once again, thank you to all of our guests. I think it's been a very insightful, very interesting morning, both on the women's health debate that we had and our guests, and it was wonderful to have them here, and also on this housing debate this morning. So thank you all once again.
Bernard? Hello, sorry, it's working now. First of all, just give my thanks to everybody who took